Imagine waking up one morning with an absolute, unshakable certainty that you are dead, that your body is merely a corpse animated by some unknown force, that you are a walking cadaver experiencing existence in a state between life and death. This is the lived reality of individuals suffering from Capgras delusion, a rare neuropsychiatric condition in which a person becomes convinced that they are deceased, decomposing, or have never been alive at all, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary presented by their own functioning body and conscious mind. These individuals may refuse to bathe because they believe decomposing bodies should not be cleaned, or they may abandon social connections entirely because they feel they no longer belong to the world of the living, and some have even requested to be placed in mortuaries or have attempted to make their final arrangements while remaining completely lucid in every other aspect of their thinking. The mechanism behind this haunting condition appears to involve a fundamental disconnection between the brain's emotional recognition systems and its sensory processing centers, likely stemming from damage or dysfunction in areas responsible for integrating bodily awareness with emotional significance. When a person looks at their hand or hears their own voice, the sensory information reaches the brain intact, but the emotional weight that normally accompanies self-recognition fails to register, creating what neuroscientists describe as a kind of emotional anesthesia toward oneself. The brain receives the signal that the body exists and functions, yet fails to generate the fundamental feeling of aliveness that ties us to our existence, leaving the person to construct a narrative that somehow makes logical sense of this profound disconnect, and that narrative, inexplicably, settles on the conclusion that they must actually be dead. Imagine waking up one morning and looking at your spouse, your parent, or your closest friend, and despite recognizing their face perfectly well, despite knowing every detail of their appearance, you become absolutely convinced that they are not who they claim to be, but rather an identical imposter who has somehow replaced the real person you love. This is the essence of Capgras delusion, a rare psychiatric condition in which a person maintains the unshakable belief that someone close to them has been substituted by an exact duplicate, usually with sinister intent. The afflicted individual can describe the imposter's appearance with complete accuracy, can acknowledge that this person looks exactly like the beloved family member, yet remains utterly certain of the deception. They might say things like, "I know that looks like my mother, but this is not my mother. My mother is somewhere else, and this thing is pretending to be her." The delusion typically emerges following brain injury, stroke, or as a symptom of certain psychiatric conditions, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about how the human brain constructs identity and familiarity. Neuroscientists believe the condition arises from a disconnect between the visual processing areas of the brain that handle facial recognition and the emotional centers that generate the warm feeling of familiarity we associate with loved ones. The face is processed correctly, the features are registered accurately, but the emotional resonance, the sense of recognition that should accompany seeing a familiar face, fails to activate. Rather than accepting this strange neurological gap, the brain fills the void with a logical explanation. The person must be an imposter. It is a remarkable demonstration of how powerfully our minds prioritize narrative and coherence over accepting inexplicable gaps in perception, and how the absence of emotion can seem more suspicious to us than any physical evidence could ever be reassuring. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your own hand has become a stranger to you, moving with apparent intention and purpose while your conscious mind watches helplessly from the sidelines, completely unable to command it or predict what it will do next. This is the reality of alien hand syndrome, a neurological condition so profoundly disorienting that patients often describe their affected limb as though it belongs to someone else entirely, acting out its own agenda while they remain trapped as mere observers in their own bodies. A person might find their hand reaching for objects they never consciously decided to grasp, buttoning their shirt while they desperately try to unbutton it, or touching their face in ways that feel utterly foreign and involuntary. The hand moves with coordination and purpose, not in the flailing random movements of typical paralysis, but with deliberate, goal-directed actions that suggest some part of the brain is still executing commands, just not the part that considers itself to be them. The condition typically emerges following damage to the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of neural fibers that serves as the communication highway between the brain's left and right hemispheres, or from lesions in specific frontal lobe regions responsible for motor planning and voluntary control. When this critical connection is severed, whether through surgical intervention, stroke, or trauma, the two hemispheres can no longer coordinate effectively, and the hand controlled by the damaged hemisphere continues to execute motor programs independently, without the inhibitory signals that normally suppress unwanted movements. What makes this condition so psychologically unsettling is that it persists as a genuine neurological mystery, a haunting reminder that consciousness and control are far more fragmented than we typically assume, and that our sense of unified agency over our own bodies is actually a carefully maintained illusion created by constant neural communication that we never consciously experience. There exists a profoundly unsettling phenomenon observed in the final hours or moments before death, particularly in patients suffering from advanced dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or severe mental deterioration, wherein individuals who have spent months or years in states of complete cognitive absence suddenly experience a remarkable return to full consciousness, clarity, and recognition, engaging in coherent conversation with family members, asking meaningful questions, and demonstrating an acute awareness of their circumstances before slipping away entirely. Medical professionals and families have documented thousands of these cases, where a patient who could not recognize their own children or form complete sentences suddenly asks specific questions about loved ones, makes profound statements about their life, or even gives what appears to be a final blessing or farewell, displaying a level of mental acuity that seems neurologically impossible given the documented deterioration of their brain tissue. The mechanism behind this phenomenon remains largely unexplained by modern neuroscience, though researchers have proposed several theories involving a final surge of neurochemical activity, a last concentrated burst of energy from the dying brain, or possibly the release of endorphins and other compounds that might temporarily restore function to damaged neural networks in ways we do not yet understand. Some suggest that the brain, sensing its own imminent shutdown, mobilizes its remaining resources in a final effort to achieve coherence, while others wonder whether these moments represent something our current medical models are simply not equipped to measure or fully comprehend. Imagine waking in the dead of night, your consciousness suddenly snapping into full awareness while your body remains utterly frozen, completely unable to move a single muscle, and perhaps more unsettling still, you sense a dark presence in the room with you, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of your bed or pressing down upon your chest with an invisible weight that makes breathing feel like an enormous effort. This phenomenon, known as sleep paralysis, affects millions of people throughout their lifetimes, striking without warning and lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several agonizing minutes, during which your mind races with fear and confusion while your body lies motionless and defenseless. The experience feels entirely real, wholly convincing, and deeply disturbing, often leaving people shaken for hours afterward, wondering if something supernatural has genuinely touched them or if their mind has somehow betrayed them in the darkness. What makes this experience even more perplexing is that there is actually a perfectly logical neurological explanation underlying the entire phenomenon, one rooted in the normal mechanics of human sleep itself. During the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, your brain paralyses your voluntary muscles intentionally to prevent you from physically acting out your dreams, thrashing about and potentially injuring yourself or someone sleeping nearby. And this muscle paralysis is an elegant protective mechanism that normally works flawlessly without your conscious awareness. However, occasionally a temporary disconnection occurs between your sleeping and waking brain states, and your consciousness awakens while this paralysis remains firmly in place, leaving you trapped in a state of absolute helplessness with your mind fully alert but your body completely unable to respond to your will. Consider the strange experience of someone who has lost a leg in an accident, yet finds themselves reaching down to scratch an itch on a foot that no longer exists, or waking in the night with a sharp pain shooting through toes that were amputated years ago. This phenomenon, known as phantom limb sensation, affects the vast majority of people who have undergone amputation, and it represents one of the most peculiar disconnects between physical reality and the persistent signals of the human nervous system. The person lying in bed knows with absolute certainty that their limb is gone. They can see the empty space where it once was, and yet their brain continues to send and receive signals as though the limb remains intact, creating a ghostly echo of a body part that has ceased to exist in any material form. The sensations can range from a gentle tingling or numbness to excruciating phantom pain, where the absent limb seems to cramp or burn with an intensity that rivals the pain of actual injuries. This occurs because the brain does not simply receive information from the body like a passive receiver. Instead, it maintains an internal map, a neural blueprint of the body's structure that persists even when that structure has been fundamentally altered. The spinal cord and brainstem continue to process signals from the remaining stumps and surrounding tissues, while the cortical regions dedicated to the missing limb remain activated, creating a form of neural ghost that refuses to acknowledge the physical absence. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that it challenges our basic understanding of how we know our own bodies, revealing that our sense of self is not a direct perception of reality, but rather a constructed experience that our brains assemble from incomplete and often contradictory information. Even more remarkably, these phantom sensations can persist for decades, suggesting that the neural pathways dedicated to lost limbs retain their functional integrity long after the physical appendage has disappeared, as if the mind refuses to accept an amendment to its internal body map. Imagine waking up one morning after a stroke, a head injury, or some other neurological event, only to discover that you no longer sound like yourself, that the voice emerging from your throat carries the distinct accent of a country you have never visited and a language you do not speak fluently, if at all. This is the deeply unsettling reality of foreign accent syndrome, a rare neurological condition in which a person's speech suddenly transforms to exhibit characteristics of a foreign accent following brain injury or damage to specific neural pathways. The condition is not about the person actually learning a new language or consciously adopting an accent, but rather a disruption in the motor control systems that govern speech production, causing the brain to misdirect the intricate muscle movements required for articulation, intonation, and rhythm. When the areas of the brain responsible for coordinating these precise muscular actions are damaged or disrupted, the result can be a reorganization of speech patterns that listeners perceive as distinctly foreign, even though the individual is producing sounds from their native language with altered phonetic characteristics. The mechanism appears to involve damage to the neural circuits that control the timing, force, and coordination of the muscles in the mouth, tongue, lips, and vocal cords, forcing the brain to compensate by creating new motor patterns that, when heard by others, sound remarkably like someone speaking with the accent of a different region or nation. What makes this phenomenon particularly haunting is the profound psychological impact on patients who suddenly find themselves sounding like strangers to their own families and communities, their sense of identity fractured by a voice that no longer belongs to them, yet they remain fully conscious and aware of this bewildering transformation occurring in real time. Imagine being jolted awake in the middle of the night by what feels like a massive explosion occurring inside your skull, a thunderous crack or bang so vivid and so intense that your heart immediately begins to race, your body tenses, and you lie there in complete confusion wondering if something has actually happened in your home or if the sound exists only in the landscape of your mind. This is exploding head syndrome, a phenomenon that affects somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population at some point during their lives, and despite its alarming name and the genuine terror it inspires in those who experience it, the condition involves no actual pain, no physical injury, and no neurological damage whatsoever. The person experiencing an episode hears or feels an enormous imaginary sound, often described as a gunshot, a bomb, cymbals crashing together, or the shattering of glass, but it occurs only in their perception and exists nowhere else in reality. What makes this condition particularly fascinating is the mechanism behind it, which appears to involve a mismatch in the brain's sleep cycles, specifically a disruption in the transition between rapid eye movement sleep and waking consciousness. During normal sleep, the brain essentially disconnects sensory input from the environment and suppresses motor responses, so that dreams can occur without the body acting them out or processing external stimuli as real events. However, when exploding head syndrome occurs, the auditory processing centers of the brain seem to activate during this transition window before full wakefulness has been achieved, creating a vivid phantom sound that feels absolutely genuine and urgent even though no external noise has occurred. The syndrome tends to occur more frequently during periods of high stress, sleep deprivation, or excessive caffeine consumption, suggesting that an overtaxed or overstimulated nervous system becomes more prone to these misfirings. Imagine waking in the middle of the night and perceiving your bedroom as impossibly vast, the walls stretching away into infinite distance while your own body feels impossibly small, as though you've been shrunk to the size of an insect. Now imagine that your hand appears grotesquely enlarged, swollen to 3 times its normal size, while your face in the mirror seems to recede away from you at an alarming distance. This is Alice in Wonderland syndrome, a rare neurological condition in which the brain's perception of size, distance, and space becomes profoundly distorted, causing people to experience their bodies and surroundings as fundamentally wrong in scale. The condition typically occurs during migraine episodes, viral infections like Epstein-Barr virus, or as a symptom of certain neurological conditions, and what makes it particularly fascinating is that sufferers maintain full awareness that their perception is incorrect, yet they cannot override what their senses are reporting. The mechanism behind this distortion appears to involve disruption in the parietal lobe, the region of the brain responsible for processing spatial information and proprioception, which is our sense of where our body exists in space. When this area misfires, the brain receives scrambled signals about size and distance, creating a cascade of false perceptions that feel entirely real despite their impossibility. What's remarkable is that people who experience Alice in Wonderland syndrome often feel compelled to describe their experiences using the reference point of Lewis Carroll's famous novel, even though most contemporary sufferers have never read the book, suggesting that the condition has become so culturally embedded in our collective consciousness that we've essentially created a template for understanding and communicating about an otherwise inexplicable neurological malfunction, and in doing so, we've paradoxically made the bizarre feel almost normalized through literary reference. Imagine walking into a coffee shop and encountering someone who greets you warmly by name, speaking to you as though you have known them for years, yet their face remains completely unrecognizable to you, a blank canvas of features that your mind simply refuses to process or store, forcing you to smile awkwardly while internally searching for any contextual clues that might reveal their identity. This is the daily reality for millions of people living with prosopagnosia, a neurological condition where the brain loses its ability to recognize and distinguish between different human faces, a deficit that seems almost impossibly cruel in a world where facial recognition forms the foundation of human social interaction and relationship building. Some individuals are born with developmental prosopagnosia, inheriting this condition through genetic pathways that remain incompletely understood by modern neuroscience, while others acquire it through brain injuries, strokes, or neurological diseases that damage the fusiform gyrus, a specialized region located in the temporal lobe that has evolved specifically to process and catalog facial features. The mechanism behind this peculiar blindness reveals something fascinating about how the brain compartmentalizes information. Because people with prosopagnosia can typically see perfectly well, their vision remains sharp and clear, yet their visual cortex simply fails to integrate facial data into a coherent recognition system that would allow them to match a face to a memory or identity. What makes this condition truly remarkable is that individuals with prosopagnosia often retain the ability to recognize people through other sensory channels, learning to identify loved ones through voice, gait, distinctive clothing choices, or even specific mannerisms, essentially rewiring their social perception around the one sensory input their brain seems most reliable at processing. Imagine a patient who has suffered damage to their primary visual cortex, the region at the back of the brain responsible for conscious sight. When you ask this person what they see, they report nothing but darkness, a complete absence of visual experience. Yet when you place an object in their blind field and ask them to point at it, their hand moves with remarkable accuracy toward the target, as if guided by some invisible knowledge. When you ask them to guess the color of a card they cannot see, their answers are correct far more often than chance would allow. When you instruct them to walk through a hallway lined with obstacles they insist they cannot perceive, they navigate around each barrier with fluid precision, never stumbling, never colliding. This phenomenon is called blind sight, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the architecture of human consciousness. The brain appears to process visual information through multiple pathways, and when the main highway of conscious vision is blocked, alternative routes continue to function in the darkness, guiding behavior and movement without ever reaching awareness. It is as though the brain contains a sophisticated navigator that operates entirely beneath the threshold of experience, collecting information about the world, making decisions, and directing the body's actions, all while the conscious mind remains convinced of total blindness. This mechanism persists because the brain has evolved multiple redundancies for survival, older neural pathways that prioritize motor coordination and basic navigation over the luxury of conscious experience. We have normalized this fragmentation of mind and body so completely that it barely disturbs us, yet it suggests that enormous portions of our cognitive life may be operating invisibly, that we may be guided by knowledge we do not know we possess, and that consciousness itself may be merely a thin narrative layer applied after our brain has already decided what to do. Imagine being asked to close your eyes and picture an apple sitting on a table in front of you, and then imagine the strange realization that you cannot actually see anything at all, that there is no mental image forming in your consciousness despite your best efforts to visualize. And this is the daily reality for millions of people living with a condition called aphantasia, a neurological variation in which individuals possess no functioning mind's eye and cannot voluntarily create visual imagery in their thoughts. For most of human history, this condition went entirely unrecognized and unnamed because the vast majority of people simply assumed that everyone experienced the world in the same way they did, that when someone mentioned visualizing or imagining something, they were accessing an actual internal visual experience, a cinema of the mind that plays scenes and images with remarkable clarity and detail. However, for people with aphantasia, there is no such cinema, no internal visual display, only abstract knowledge that an apple exists, that it has certain properties and characteristics, yet without the accompanying visual sensation that others describe with such ease. The mechanism behind aphantasia appears to involve differences in how the brain's visual cortex and other regions communicate and activate, suggesting that while the neural pathways necessary for seeing the external world remain intact, the voluntary generation of internal visual imagery depends on a specific connectivity pattern that simply does not occur in aphantasic brains. And neuroimaging studies have begun to reveal subtle but significant differences in activation patterns during tasks that require mental visualization. Imagine possessing a memory so precise and comprehensive that you can recall nearly every day of your life with photographic clarity, remembering not just major events, but the seemingly insignificant details that most people forget within hours or days. This is the reality for those who experience hyperthymesia, a rare neurological condition in which individuals retain an extraordinarily detailed autobiographical memory that operates almost like a perfect internal recording device. A person with hyperthymesia might remember exactly what they wore on a random Tuesday 3 years ago, the specific weather conditions of that morning, the conversation they overheard at a coffee shop, the emotional texture of an ordinary afternoon, and countless other mundane details that the typical human brain naturally filters away. This condition, first formally documented in the medical literature in the early 2006, represents the inverse of amnesia, yet researchers have discovered that despite this seemingly advantageous trait, people with hyperthymesia often struggle in ways that conventional wisdom would not predict. The mechanism underlying hyperthymesia appears to involve exceptional connectivity and activity in the brain regions responsible for memory formation and retrieval, including the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobe structures, combined with an apparent inability to implement the selective forgetting process that allows most people to move through life without being overwhelmed by past information. The human brain has evolved to forget as much as it remembers, deliberately discarding details to reduce cognitive load and allow mental flexibility. Yet individuals with total recall cannot engage in this protective forgetting, meaning their consciousness becomes increasingly populated with memories that accumulate and persist without the natural erosion that typically occurs. Imagine tasting the color blue when you hear a particular song, or seeing specific colors bloom across your visual field whenever someone speaks a certain word aloud, or feeling the texture of velvet whenever you encounter the number 7. For roughly 4% of the human population, this is not imagination at all, but rather a consistent and involuntary neurological experience known as synesthesia. These individuals possess what researchers describe as cross-wired sensory pathways in the brain, where stimulation of one sensory system automatically and reliably triggers experiences in another sensory system, creating a blended and deeply unusual perceptual reality. The condition typically manifests in childhood and persists throughout a person's entire lifetime, shaping how they experience the world in ways that most of us cannot even comprehend. A person with color grapheme synesthesia, for instance, might see the letter A as inherently red or the number 5 as distinctly purple, and this association remains perfectly consistent year after year. Someone with chromesthesia experiences colors in response to musical notes or sounds, so that a violin's high note might always appear as bright yellow, while a low bass rumble manifests as deep purple. The neurological basis of synesthesia appears to involve increased connectivity between regions of the brain that normally operate independently, particularly in sensory processing areas, though the exact mechanisms remain incompletely understood. What makes this phenomenon especially intriguing is that it operates entirely outside conscious control, and individuals with synesthesia cannot simply choose to turn it off or suppress these cross-sensory experiences any more than you can choose not to see the color of an object placed directly before you. Rather remarkably, despite the apparent strangeness of this neurological variation, synesthesia is not classified as a disorder or pathological condition, but rather as a natural variation in human neurology, and many synesthetes report that their condition actually enhances their creativity, memory, and artistic abilities in meaningful ways. Imagine waking up one morning with an absolute certainty that a specific person, perhaps someone you know or a public figure, is following you everywhere, disguising themselves with different appearances, changing their voice, altering their mannerisms, yet always remaining fundamentally that same individual orchestrating an elaborate campaign to monitor your every move. This is the essence of Fregoli Delusion, a rare psychiatric condition named after Leopoldo Fregoli, an Italian quick-change artist from the 19th century who was famous for his ability to transform his appearance with remarkable speed and skill. Patients suffering from this condition become convinced that various different people they encounter throughout their daily lives are actually the same person in disguise, using sophisticated disguises, costumes, makeup, and vocal modifications to maintain an elaborate surveillance operation. The delusion typically focuses on a single target individual who the patient believes is relentlessly pursuing them, and this conviction remains unshakable despite overwhelming logical evidence to the contrary. What makes this condition particularly fascinating from a neurological perspective is that it represents a fundamental breakdown in the brain's facial recognition and identity processing systems, combined with an overactive pattern recognition mechanism that connects unrelated observations into a coherent but entirely false narrative. The mind, in its effort to make sense of seemingly coincidental encounters, begins to force connections between disparate individuals, convincing itself that these separate people are actually one person engaged in an elaborate deception. The brain's reward system becomes reinforced each time a new piece of evidence seems to confirm the delusion, whether that evidence is actually meaningful or completely circumstantial. Despite the obvious logical impossibilities inherent in someone appearing in multiple locations simultaneously or maintaining such an exhaustive disguise operation indefinitely, the person experiencing Fregoli delusion cannot simply think their way out of the conviction. Imagine losing your sight completely, watching the world fade into darkness after decades of seeing, and then discovering that your mind has begun creating elaborate visual hallucinations that feel entirely real to you, yet you know they cannot possibly be there. This is the peculiar experience of Charles Bonnet syndrome, a neurological condition that strikes individuals who have experienced significant vision loss or complete blindness, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about how our brains construct reality even when the sensory input that once fed it has vanished entirely. People with this condition report seeing vivid, detailed scenes that range from the mundane to the fantastical, geometric patterns, faces, landscapes, animals, entire crowds of people moving through their visual field with perfect clarity and coherent behavior, all while the person experiencing these visions remains fully aware that nothing is actually there before their eyes. The hallucinations are not frightening in the way we might expect. They are often strangely beautiful or simply ordinary, and the remarkable aspect is that those who experience them typically understand with absolute certainty that these visions are not real, maintaining perfect insight even as their brains present them with convincing sensory experiences. What makes Charles Bonnet syndrome so intellectually fascinating is the mechanism underlying it. When the visual cortex of the brain suddenly receives no input from the eyes due to blindness or severe vision loss, it does not simply go quiet and inactive as we might logically expect, but instead begins generating its own electrical activity, creating patterns and images spontaneously from its own neural circuitry. The brain, it seems, abhors the absence of sensory information, and when deprived of external visual input, it begins filling the void with internally generated imagery, essentially talking to itself in the only language it knows, which is the language of vision. Imagine lying in a hospital bed during surgery, fully conscious yet somehow floating above yourself, watching doctors work on your body from a vantage point near the ceiling, observing the scene with perfect clarity despite having no eyes to see from that impossible angle, and then later recounting details you could not possibly have witnessed from your position on the operating table. Out-of-body experiences, often abbreviated as OBEs, represent one of the most perplexing phenomena that the human mind can produce, affecting somewhere between 8 and 15% of the population at some point during their lifetime, and occurring most frequently during moments of extreme stress, surgical procedures, near-death events, or sometimes spontaneously during deep meditation or the twilight state between sleep and wakefulness. The experience typically involves a profound sense of separation from one's physical body, an overwhelming conviction of consciousness existing independently in space, often accompanied by the sensation of floating or flying, seeing oneself from an external perspective, and accessing information or viewpoints that seem to defy the limitations of normal sensory perception. Neuroscientists have identified that these experiences arise from a temporary disruption in the brain's integration of sensory information, particularly in regions like the temporoparietal junction and the insula, areas responsible for processing bodily awareness and spatial orientation, creating what researchers call a mismatch between visual input and proprioceptive signals, the sensations that normally tell us where our body is in space. When these signals become desynchronized, the brain constructs an alternative model of reality in which consciousness appears to exist outside the body, generating an experience so vivid and convincing that individuals who undergo it often report it as more real than ordinary waking consciousness, which creates a profound explanatory challenge for conventional neuroscience. There exists a peculiar psychological zone where our perception of humanoid objects creates a strange and unsettling emotional response, a phenomenon that researchers call the Uncanny Valley. When we encounter things that are almost human but not quite, like certain types of robots, detailed dolls, or computer-generated faces that fall just short of perfect realism, we experience an unexpected discomfort that seems disproportionate to what we are actually observing. A completely mechanical robot with obvious joints and artificial features causes us no distress whatsoever, and a perfectly realistic human face delights or engages us normally, but somewhere in that middle ground, where something mimics human characteristics with eerie precision, yet remains fundamentally artificial, our brains rebel with a sense of wrongness and dread. This uncanny valley effect demonstrates that our minds do not evaluate human-likeness on a simple linear scale where more human equals better. Instead, we possess a more complex perceptual system that becomes deeply uncomfortable when something approaches human realism without achieving it completely. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves multiple layers of cognitive processing working simultaneously. Our brains have evolved to recognize and respond to human facial features and movements with remarkable precision, as social cognition has always been essential to human survival and cooperation. When we see something that triggers most of our human recognition systems but fails to trigger all of them consistently, our minds enter a state of cognitive conflict and uncertainty. We cannot comfortably categorize the object as either clearly artificial or genuinely human, and this categorical ambiguity produces genuine psychological discomfort. Additionally, the uncanny valley may tap into deeper evolutionary responses related to disease, death, and abnormality, as something that looks almost human but moves or appears subtly wrong might have once signaled danger or infection in our ancestral environment. Imagine watching someone else stub their toe against a table leg, and instead of simply observing their pain with empathy, you actually feel a distinct sensation of pressure or impact on your own toe in that exact moment. This is the reality for people who experience mirror touch synesthesia, a neurological condition in which the visual perception of touch on another person automatically triggers a genuine tactile sensation in the corresponding location on the observer's own body. A woman might see her friend get a gentle pat on the shoulder and simultaneously experience that same pat landing on her own shoulder, not as imagination or metaphor, but as an actual physical sensation that her nervous system registers and processes. When someone with this condition watches a video of a massage being performed on another person's back, they feel the massage occurring on their own back with remarkable specificity and clarity. The sensation is involuntary, immediate, and entirely independent of conscious intention or willingness to experience it. The mechanism underlying mirror touch synesthesia appears to involve an unusual hyperactivation of the mirror neuron system combined with atypical connections between sensory and motor brain regions. Mirror neurons are neural cells that fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe someone else performing that same action, and they play a fundamental role in empathy and social understanding. In people with mirror touch synesthesia, these mirror neurons seem to be communicating with the somatosensory cortex, which processes physical touch, in ways that create an actual sensory experience rather than merely activating empathetic understanding. The brain is essentially blurring the boundary between observation and sensation, between watching touch happen and feeling touch occur. Brain imaging studies have revealed unusual patterns of neural connectivity in individuals with this condition, suggesting that their brains are literally wired differently in ways that allow visual information to directly trigger tactile processing. Imagine a person who has suffered a stroke that has left one side of their body completely paralyzed, yet when asked to move their arm, they insist they can do it, even as their limb remains motionless at their side, and when presented with undeniable evidence of their paralysis, they construct elaborate explanations for why they simply chose not to move it at that particular moment. Or they deny the reality altogether with such conviction that observers find themselves questioning their own perceptions of what they are witnessing. This phenomenon is called anosognosia, a condition where individuals lack awareness of their own neurological or physical deficits, and it represents one of the most fascinating and deeply unsettling revelations about how the human mind protects itself from unbearable truths. The condition emerges from the complex architecture of the brain itself, where the regions responsible for self-monitoring and consciousness become disconnected from the regions where damage has occurred, creating a situation in which the brain literally cannot send the signal that something is wrong, cannot register the discrepancy between what the person believes they can do and what their body is actually capable of accomplishing. The person with anosognosia is not lying or in denial in the conventional sense. Rather, their brain has constructed a false model of reality that feels absolutely authentic from the inside, and this false model is protected by the same neural mechanisms that normally help us maintain a stable sense of self and agency. Imagine waking up after a stroke and discovering that half of your world has simply ceased to exist, not because your eyes have failed you, but because your brain has decided that an entire side of space is no longer worth acknowledging. A patient with hemispatial neglect, typically caused by damage to the right hemisphere of the brain, will eat food from only one side of their plate, completely ignoring the items on the left, as though an invisible boundary divides the world into the worthy and the invisible. They might dress only half of their body, combing hair on one side while leaving the other side completely unkempt, or shave only one half of their face with absolute precision while the other half remains untouched and unnoticed. When asked to draw a clock or a flower, they will sketch all the details on one side, leaving the other side blank or grotesquely compressed, and yet when shown their own drawing, they will insist it is complete and correct, entirely unaware of what is missing. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the brain's complex system of spatial attention and awareness, controlled largely by the right parietal and frontal cortices. When these areas sustain damage, the brain essentially stops allocating attentional resources to the opposite side of space, creating a form of blindness that is not optical but cognitive, not a problem with the eyes, but a problem with the mind's willingness to process what the eyes are seeing. What makes hemispatial neglect particularly fascinating and deeply unsettling is that it persists with remarkable stubbornness even when patients are made explicitly aware of it, even when they are told repeatedly that they are neglecting half of their world, even when they look directly at something on the neglected side and still fail to truly see it. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your body has stopped sending pain signals to your brain, not due to injury or illness, but because you were simply born this way. Congenital insensitivity to pain, also known as congenital analgesia, is an extraordinarily rare neurological condition where individuals are born without the ability to feel physical pain in the traditional sense. These people can experience touch, temperature, and pressure, but the specific neural pathways that transmit pain signals never developed properly in their nervous systems. A child with this condition might break their arm during play and continue playing without knowing anything is wrong, discovering the injury only when an adult notices swelling or deformity. They might burn their hand on a stove and feel warmth, but not the urgent warning that pain should trigger, allowing tissue damage to accumulate before anyone intervenes. Some individuals with congenital analgesia have bitten through their own lips or tongues without realizing it, or developed severe infections from unnoticed injuries that festered beneath the skin. The mechanism behind this condition lies in the development of specific neural pathways, particularly those involving substance P and other neuropeptides that normally transmit pain signals from the periphery to the brain's pain processing centers. In people with congenital analgesia, these pathways fail to form correctly, creating a disconnect between injury and perception. The brain receives the information that tissue damage has occurred, yet it does not generate the conscious sensation of pain that would normally demand attention and action. Interestingly, individuals with this condition still demonstrate protective reflexes, jerking their hand away from danger even without conscious awareness, suggesting that some automatic responses remain intact while conscious perception vanishes. What makes congenital analgesia particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how profoundly it reveals that pain is not merely a sensation, but a critical warning system that shapes how we navigate the world. Imagine a patient sitting in a doctor's office who places their hand on a hot plate and their hand begins to burn, the skin reddening and blistering, yet the patient displays no emotional reaction whatsoever, speaking calmly about other matters as though nothing at all is happening to their body. This is the strange and deeply unsettling neurological condition known as pain asymbolia, a rare disorder where individuals can perceive pain signals from their body, but experience a complete disconnection from the emotional suffering that pain normally carries with it. The patient knows intellectually that their hand is burning, they can feel the sensation, they might even tell you precisely how hot it is and describe the physical characteristics of the injury. Yet there is an eerie absence of the distress that typically accompanies such damage, no urgency to remove their hand, no facial grimace, no emotional response whatsoever. The condition emerges from damage to specific regions of the brain, particularly areas in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions responsible not for detecting pain signals themselves, but rather for processing the emotional and affective dimensions of pain, the part of our consciousness that transforms a mere sensation into suffering. When these areas become damaged through stroke, trauma, or surgical intervention, the neural pathway that normally connects the sensory experience of pain to our emotional response becomes severed, creating a dissociation between the physical sensation and its psychological interpretation. What makes this condition so profoundly strange is that it reveals pain to be not a single unified phenomenon, but rather a composite construction of the brain, with distinct neurological systems handling different aspects of the experience. And when one system fails, we discover that sensation and suffering are not inevitably linked as we might assume, that the brain can theoretically maintain awareness of damage while remaining emotionally indifferent to it. A realization that challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness and the relationship between body and mind. Your memory is not a recording device, and yet your mind presents it to you as though it were absolute truth, weaving together fragments of real experiences with invented details and false conclusions into a seamless narrative that feels entirely authentic. Confabulation is the unconscious act of filling in gaps in memory with fabricated information, not out of deliberate dishonesty, but because your brain finds uncertainty deeply uncomfortable and actively works to resolve it by creating plausible details that feel like genuine recollections. When you remember a childhood birthday party, you might recall the cake, the decorations, and specific conversations with perfect clarity, believing wholeheartedly in these memories, only to discover years later through photographs or other witnesses that the cake was actually a different flavor. The decorations were not as you remembered them, and that particular conversation may have happened on an entirely different occasion or not at all. Your brain does not consciously recognize that it is filling in these details. Instead, it draws upon general knowledge, schemas about how birthday parties typically unfold, emotions associated with that period of life, and random neural activations that feel like authentic memories, blending them all together into a coherent story that satisfies your need for a complete narrative. This happens not because you are unreliable or dishonest, but because memory itself is a constructive process rather than a retrieval process, and your brain prioritizes narrative coherence and emotional significance over photographic accuracy. The truly unsettling aspect of confabulation is that it persists even when you are aware that it occurs, even when you have been explicitly told that your memories are unreliable, even when you possess evidence that contradicts your recollection. We continue to trust our memories implicitly because the alternative, living in constant doubt about what is real in our own past, would create such profound psychological distress that our minds have evolved to simply not permit it. We believe our own stories because we must. Imagine a patient lying on an operating table who undergoes a procedure to sever the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, a surgery sometimes performed to treat severe epilepsy by preventing seizures from spreading between sides. After the surgery heals and the patient recovers, something profoundly unsettling emerges during testing. When researchers show an image only to the right visual field, which connects to the left hemisphere where language is typically processed, the patient can speak and describe what they see without hesitation. But when that same image is shown only to the left visual field, which connects to the right hemisphere, the patient cannot verbally report what they witnessed, even though behavioral tests reveal the right hemisphere clearly perceived and processed the information. It is as though two separate minds exist within one skull, each with its own perceptions, preferences, and even contradictory desires, unable to communicate with one another through their severed connection. The left hemisphere speaks and narrates the unified story of consciousness, while the right hemisphere silently processes information, responds to stimuli, and makes choices that the speaking side cannot consciously articulate or even know about. This phenomenon challenges our most fundamental assumption about consciousness itself, that unified awareness arises from the brain as a singular entity. The split-brain patient forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness might not be one indivisible thing, but rather an emergent property that requires intact communication between hemispheres, a phenomenon so counterintuitive that we still struggle to fully comprehend what it means for a person to possess multiple centers of awareness simultaneously. Imagine two people living together, perhaps a parent and child or two siblings or even a married couple, and one of them begins to experience delusions so vivid and convincing that they construct an entire alternative reality around a threat that doesn't exist, a conspiracy that has no evidence, or a belief system that contradicts all observable facts. And then, over weeks or months, the other person begins to adopt these exact same beliefs, not through external persuasion from others, but simply through prolonged exposure to the first person's absolute conviction, until both individuals are equally convinced of something that is entirely false, defending it with the same intensity, the same logical frameworks, and the same dismissal of contradicting evidence, a phenomenon that psychiatrists have named Folie À Deux, which translates from French as the madness of two. Imagine walking into a room in your own home, a space you have entered thousands of times, and for a brief moment everything feels completely foreign and unfamiliar, as though you have never seen it before in your entire life, despite knowing with absolute certainty that you have lived there for years. And this strange sensation of sudden estrangement from the familiar is called Jamais Vu, which is French for never seen, and it stands in direct contrast to its more famous counterpart, Déjà Vu. Yet it remains far more mysterious and poorly understood by modern neuroscience. During a Jamais Vu episode, your mind experiences a peculiar disconnect between recognition and familiarity, where the automatic processes that normally tag experiences as known or unknown seem to misfire temporarily, causing your brain to question the validity of memories it has certainly stored and consolidated over many years. The psychological mechanism behind Jamais Vu appears to involve a temporary disruption in the neural networks responsible for semantic memory and the feeling of familiarity, possibly occurring when there is a brief lag or desynchronization between different regions of the brain that process memory and recognition, such as the hippocampus and the temporal lobes, which normally work in seamless coordination to create that comfortable sense of knowing and belonging in familiar spaces and situations. What makes Jamais Vu particularly fascinating is that it often occurs precisely when we are in our most familiar environments, during moments of routine and automaticity, suggesting that the very mechanisms that usually protect us from overthinking the obvious can occasionally malfunction in ways that throw everything into temporary question. And yet we recover almost immediately, our confidence in our own memories returning as quickly as it was shaken. Leaving behind only a fleeting moment of existential disorientation that most people rarely discuss or even fully remember once the sensation has passed. You walk into a coffee shop you have never visited before, and as you approach the counter, an inexplicable sensation washes over you, a profound sense that you have lived this exact moment previously, that you recognize the arrangement of the espresso machine, the positioning of the barista, the angle of the morning light filtering through the windows, even though your conscious mind knows with absolute certainty that this is your first time in this location. This is the phenomenon known as déjà vu, a French term meaning already seen, and it represents one of the mind's most intriguing and persistent mysteries, affecting approximately 60 to 70% of people at least once in their lifetime, with the average person experiencing it at least several times per year. The experience typically lasts only seconds or minutes, yet it leaves behind a peculiar residue of certainty and confusion that lingers far longer than the sensation itself. Neuroscientists and psychologists have proposed numerous theories to explain this bewildering experience, with one prominent explanation suggesting that déjà vu occurs due to a brief glitch in the brain's memory systems, specifically a temporary disconnection between the processes that encode new information and the processes that retrieve stored memories, causing the brain to mistakenly flag a novel situation as familiar even though no genuine memories exist to support this recognition. Another theory proposes that déjà vu results from an unconscious perception of structural similarities between the current situation and previous experiences that our conscious mind fails to explicitly recognize. Yet our memory systems detect the pattern match and generate a feeling of familiarity without providing us with the specific details of what we supposedly remember. Some researchers have theorized that déjà vu might involve a momentary confusion between short-term and long-term memory systems, or a temporary overlap in the neural pathways responsible for encoding and retrieving information. You walk into a room with absolute certainty that you know exactly what you came for, your purpose crystalline and undeniable in your mind, and yet the moment you cross the threshold, that intention vanishes completely as though it had never existed at all. You stand there confused, retracing your steps back through the doorway, and suddenly, miraculously, the memory returns, flooding back with all its original clarity and specificity. This phenomenon, so common that most people experience it multiple times each week without ever truly acknowledging its strangeness, is called the doorway effect, and it represents one of the most peculiar glitches in human memory and spatial cognition. Psychologists have discovered through controlled experiments that this effect is not merely anecdotal or imaginary, but is instead a demonstrable aspect of how our brains organize and compartmentalize information based on environmental contexts. The doorway itself acts as what researchers call an event boundary, a psychological marker that causes our brains to file away the previous mental context and prepare for an entirely new one, effectively closing the previous chapter of intention before the new chapter has properly begun. When you move through physical space, and especially when you cross a clear demarcation like a doorway or threshold, your brain interprets this as a shift in environment significant enough to warrant an episodic memory partition, and in doing so, it temporarily severs your access to the intention that belonged to the previous space. This happens because our memory systems evolved to help us navigate and process distinct locations and situations, rather than maintaining continuity across arbitrary architectural features. Imagine sitting alone in a quiet room and repeating a single word aloud, over and over again, the same word with each breath you take, the same syllables rolling off your tongue with mechanical consistency, and then something peculiar begins to happen to the word itself, as though the meaning has been slowly drained from it like water through a sieve, until eventually you are left merely pronouncing sounds without any sense of what those sounds actually represent, the word becoming nothing more than empty phonetic noise. A string of meaningless vibrations in the air. This phenomenon is called semantic satiation, and it occurs when a word or concept loses its meaning through continuous repetition, a temporary disconnection between the symbol and the thing it refers to. If you say the word butterfly 50 times in succession, butterfly becomes just a sound, divorced entirely from the image of the insect, and this happens because of how our brains process language and meaning. The neural pathways that activate when we encounter a word grow fatigued from repeated stimulation, and this fatigue causes the semantic representation to temporarily weaken and fade from conscious access, as though your mind has decided it no longer needs to process the full meaning since it already knows what the word refers to. Your brain essentially says to itself that efficiency matters more than completeness, that it can shut down the machinery of meaning-making and simply let the sounds pass through without interpretation. Imagine watching a video of a person's face as they speak, and you hear them say the sound ba ba ba, but if you look closely at their lips, you can see they're actually forming the shape for ga ga ga, and something remarkable happens in your brain. You don't hear what's actually being played through your speakers, but rather a completely different sound that your visual system has convinced your auditory system must be correct, a phenomenon that researchers call the McGurk Effect. Discovered in 1976 by psychologist Harry McGurk and his colleague John MacDonald, who were exploring the boundaries between what we see and what we hear. The effect demonstrates that our sense of hearing is not actually independent, but rather deeply intertwined with our visual perception, so much so that when these two senses contradict each other, your brain doesn't simply average them out or trust one over the other, but instead creates an entirely new perception that existed in neither the audio nor the visual input alone. A sound that your mind has synthesized from the conflict between what your eyes tell you about mouth movements and what your ears receive from the soundtrack. This occurs because your brain processes speech as a multimodal experience, where the visual information about lip shapes and tongue positions contributes significantly to phoneme recognition. And this integration happens so automatically and so completely that even when you're explicitly told about the mismatch and shown the contradiction, you continue to hear the illusory sound rather than the actual audio being transmitted. A persistence that reveals how deeply embedded this visual influence is in the architecture of human perception. Imagine sitting at a table with your arm resting flat on its surface, hidden behind a screen or barrier so that you cannot see it, while directly in front of you in full view rests a realistic rubber hand positioned exactly where your real hand would be if you could see it. A researcher then takes a soft brush and begins stroking both your hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in perfect synchronization, touching them in the same location at precisely the same moment, over and over again for several minutes. Within a surprisingly short period of time, something remarkable happens inside your brain. You begin to feel as though the rubber hand is actually your hand, that it somehow belongs to your body, and when the researcher suddenly picks up a hammer and brings it down toward the rubber hand as if to strike it, you experience a genuine sense of panic and alarm, your body tensing as though real danger is approaching your actual limb. This is the rubber hand illusion, one of the most striking demonstrations of how flexible and easily deceived our sense of body ownership truly is. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what neuroscientists call multisensory integration, the brain's remarkable ability to combine information from multiple sensory channels into a unified perception of reality. When your sense of touch from your real hand receives identical input at the identical moment as your visual perception of the rubber hand being touched, your brain essentially decides that these sensations must belong to the same object, must be coming from the same location in space, and therefore the rubber hand must be yours. Your brain prioritizes consistency and coherence in its sensory experience above strict adherence to anatomical accuracy, and it willingly updates its body map, its internal three-dimensional representation of where your body parts are located and what belongs to you based on this cross-sensory evidence. Imagine sitting in a comfortable chair while wearing a virtual reality headset that shows you a live video feed of a different body, perhaps a body made of rubber, or a body of a different gender, or even the body of a child or an elderly person. A researcher sits beside your real body and strokes your actual arm with a paintbrush while, simultaneously, the virtual body you're seeing on the screen is being stroked in exactly the same location and at precisely the same moment. Within seconds of this synchronized stimulation, something remarkable happens in your mind. You begin to feel as though the virtual body is actually your body. The sense of ownership over your own physical form, something you've experienced continuously since infancy and assumed was immutable and tied directly to your actual flesh, suddenly transfers to an entirely different vessel. This phenomenon is known as the body transfer illusion, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of self and embodiment that neuroscientists have only begun to understand. The mechanism underlying this illusion operates through what researchers call multisensory integration, which is the brain's remarkable ability to bind together information from different sensory channels into a unified experience. When your visual system sees a body being touched and your tactile system simultaneously feels the corresponding touch on your actual skin, your brain essentially votes with confidence that these sensations belong to the same body, the one you're observing. The brain doesn't pause to verify ownership through some deeper, more authentic channel. Instead, it simply accepts the multisensory consensus as truth. This process evolved to help us navigate a complex sensory world efficiently, but it reveals that what feels like an undeniable core of identity, the bedrock certainty that you are specifically and exclusively inhabiting your particular body, is actually just a convenient construction built from sensory inputs. Consider the moment when you glance at an analog clock with a sweeping second hand, and you notice that the first second always seems to last longer than the subsequent seconds that follow, a phenomenon so subtle yet so universally experienced that most people fail to recognize it as anything unusual at all. This peculiar distortion of time perception is called chronostasis, and it represents one of the most elegant demonstrations of how your brain actively constructs your experience of reality rather than passively recording it, as you might assume. When your eyes move to fixate on a new location, your visual system actually goes offline for a fraction of a second during the saccade, the rapid movement between focal points, yet your conscious experience contains no gap, no blackness, no awareness of this interruption whatsoever. Your brain fills this temporal void by extending the perceived duration of the moment you just looked at, essentially backdating your conscious perception to create the illusion of continuous uninterrupted vision, and this temporal stretching is chronostasis. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve the superior colliculus and areas of your visual cortex that prepare your brain for incoming sensory information before your eyes have even completed their movement, essentially priming your consciousness with an extended timeline that obscures the actual gap in visual input. The first tick of a clock appears elongated because you are experiencing the extended present moment that your brain has constructed to cover the period during which you were actually blind, though you never knew you were blind at all. What makes chronostasis particularly strange is that it persists as an invisible constant in your daily life, shaping your experience of time in ways you never consciously detect, and despite decades of neuroscientific understanding of this mechanism, we continue to live within this carefully constructed illusion without resistance or even awareness, accepting the temporal landscape our brains present to us as objective reality itself. When you find yourself in a genuinely dangerous situation, whether it's a near-miss car accident, a sudden fall, or an unexpected threat, something peculiar happens to your perception of time itself, and the entire experience seems to stretch and slow down, making seconds feel like minutes, and allowing you to consciously process events that would normally flash by in a blur of unconscious reaction. This phenomenon, often described by survivors of traumatic moments as everything happening in slow motion, is not an illusion of memory or a trick of imagination, but rather a documented shift in how your brain processes and encodes temporal information during acute stress. When your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, detects a threat, it triggers a cascade of neurochemical changes that fundamentally alter your cognitive performance, flooding your system with adrenaline and cortisol while simultaneously increasing the firing rate of your neurons, which causes you to perceive more sensory information per unit of clock time, making external events appear to unfold more slowly than they actually do. Your brain is essentially running at a higher processor speed, consuming information faster, and therefore the same objective duration of time contains more subjectively perceived moments, which is why people who have experienced near-fatal accidents often report being able to see the world moving as if in slow motion, noticing details they would normally miss, and having time to think through multiple responses to danger. The mechanism appears to be rooted in evolutionary survival advantage, as a brain capable of processing more information quickly during a crisis would have better odds of finding an escape route or executing a protective response. And this adaptive response has been preserved throughout millions of years of human development. Imagine you are staring at a fixed point on your screen while colorful dots drift slowly across your visual field in a rotating pattern. And as you maintain your gaze on that central point, something remarkable and deeply unsettling occurs. The moving dots seem to vanish entirely, simply disappearing from view as though they have been erased from existence, only to reappear moments later when they slow down or change direction, a phenomenon that neuroscientists call motion-induced blindness, which reveals a fundamental truth about how your visual system actually works rather than how you assume it works. When researchers first documented this effect, they discovered that your brain does not passively record everything in your field of vision like a camera recording footage. Instead, your visual cortex actively suppresses certain information based on motion patterns and predictability, because your brain has evolved to filter out irrelevant background movement so that you can focus on what truly matters, what might represent danger or opportunity in your environment. The mechanism operates something like this. When your eyes detect smooth, predictable motion at the periphery of your vision, your brain essentially decides that this information is not worth processing, that it is merely environmental noise, so it literally prevents that information from reaching your conscious awareness, effectively rendering you blind to those moving objects, even though the light from those objects is still striking your retina and signals are still traveling along your optic nerve. Imagine you're staring at a fixed point on a wall, perhaps a painting or a mark, and you deliberately keep your eyes completely still without moving them at all, not even a tiny shift in direction. After several seconds of this unwavering focus, something genuinely strange begins to happen around the edges of your vision, in the peripheral areas that surround the object you're watching. The colors start to fade, the edges become blurry and indistinct, and if you maintain this unmoving gaze long enough, the peripheral objects can almost entirely vanish from your awareness, as though they've been erased from your visual field altogether. This phenomenon is known as the Troxler Effect, named after the Swiss physician Ignaz Paul Vital Troxler, who first documented it scientifically in the 1800s, though artists and philosophers had likely noticed it for centuries before that. The moment you shift your eyes even slightly, however, the vanished objects suddenly snap back into clear visibility, reappearing as vividly as before, reminding you that they were present all along but simply hidden from your conscious perception. What makes this effect so remarkably strange is that it reveals a profound truth about human vision itself. Your eyes are not simple cameras that passively record everything in front of them. Instead, your brain is constantly engaged in an active filtering process, selecting what information deserves your attention and what can be safely ignored or suppressed. When your eyes remain perfectly still, your brain interprets the stable, unchanging visual input from your peripheral vision as unimportant background information, the kind of static environmental noise that doesn't require conscious attention or processing. Your visual system has evolved to prioritize change and movement because those things historically signaled either danger or opportunity in the natural world. A predator approaching or prey moving away would produce motion in your visual field, and your ancestors who noticed those changes quickly were far more likely to survive and reproduce. Imagine you are watching a film scene where two actors have a conversation across a table, and between camera cuts, the actor's shirt color changes from red to blue, yet you notice nothing unusual as you watch the scene unfold naturally. This phenomenon is called change blindness, and it represents one of the most humbling limitations of human perception, a cognitive blind spot so profound that we remain entirely unaware of massive alterations happening right in front of our eyes. The mechanism behind change blindness stems from a fundamental misunderstanding about how our vision actually works. We tend to believe that we see the world in perfect, complete detail at all times, that our eyes function like a video camera recording everything in high fidelity. However, the reality is far more limited and selective. Our brains do not process visual information continuously and comprehensively. Instead, they construct a simplified model of the world based on where we direct our attention, and critically, this attentional focus is remarkably narrow and easily manipulated. When a change occurs in an area of the visual field that falls outside our attentional spotlight, or when that change is masked by a brief visual disruption like a camera cut or a momentary blur, the brain fails to register the modification because it never encoded the original detail in the first place. The most striking aspect of change blindness is that it persists even when we are explicitly warned that changes will occur, even when we know intellectually that we should be vigilant. Observers watching the famous flicker paradigm experiment, where a scene is shown, briefly interrupted by a blank screen, and then shown again with one element changed, struggle to identify the alteration despite being told one exists. The change might be enormous, such as a building vanishing entirely from the background or a person disappearing from the scene, yet our visual system refuses to register it. Imagine you are watching a video of two teams of basketball players passing a ball back and forth, and you have been given one specific task. Count how many times the team in white passes the ball. You focus intently on this single objective, your eyes tracking the white jerseys, your mind working to keep an accurate count as the passes fly back and forth across the screen. Midway through the video, something extraordinary happens. A person in a gorilla suit walks directly across the court, pounds their chest, and walks off screen. Yet when researchers ask participants what they saw, approximately half of them report seeing nothing unusual at all. They did not notice the gorilla. Their eyes may have registered it, but their conscious mind never processed it because their attention was entirely consumed by the task at hand. This phenomenon is called inattentional blindness, and it reveals something profound about how our minds actually work. We tend to believe that we see everything in our visual field, that our eyes function like cameras passively recording reality. The truth is far stranger. Our brains are not designed to perceive everything around us. Instead, they are prediction machines constantly making decisions about what deserves our limited attentional resources. When you focus your attention on a specific task, your brain essentially creates a filter that allows relevant information through while blocking out everything else, even dramatic, movement-filled events that should naturally capture our notice. This is not a flaw in human perception, but rather an adaptation that has helped us survive for millennia. If we consciously processed every visual stimulus, every sound, every sensation in our environment simultaneously, we would be cognitively overwhelmed to the point of paralysis. By narrowing our focus to what matters most in any given moment, we can function effectively in complex environments. Yet despite understanding this mechanism, we continue to believe we are aware of far more than we actually are. Drivers miss pedestrians while texting because their attention is elsewhere. Imagine you walk into a store and stand before a display of two nearly identical jam jars, and you point to the one on the left because something about it appeals to you. The shopkeeper hands you the jar on the right instead, the one you didn't choose, but as they place it in your hands, you feel no sense of confusion or correction. Your mind simply accepts that this is indeed the jar you selected, and you carry it home satisfied with your decision. This phenomenon is called choice blindness, and it represents one of the most peculiar disconnects between our actions and our awareness of those actions. Researchers have conducted numerous experiments where participants are asked to make a choice between two similar options, and immediately after making their selection, the experimenter uses sleight of hand to swap the chosen item with the rejected one. Remarkably, the majority of participants fail to notice the switch and instead begin justifying why they actually prefer the item they never chose, constructing elaborate narratives about their reasoning and preferences for something that was forced upon them without their knowledge. The mechanism underlying this strange blindness appears to involve the way our brains construct narratives about our own decision-making processes. Rather than continuously monitoring the external world and comparing it against our intentions, our minds seem to operate more like storytellers that work backward from what we perceive in the present moment, creating coherent explanations for why we must have wanted what we now possess. This narrative construction system evolved to be efficient rather than accurate, allowing us to move through the world without constantly second-guessing ourselves or drowning in perpetual doubt about our choices. Yet what makes choice blindness so remarkable is how it persists even when we know intellectually that such deceptions are possible, suggesting that our conscious awareness arrives late to the party of decision-making, serving primarily to rationalize choices that have already been made by deeper, faster systems operating beneath our notice. Imagine sitting in a completely darkened room with half ping-pong balls placed gently over your eyes, a uniform hum of white noise filling your ears through headphones, and your entire visual field flooded with nothing but soft, undifferentiated red light from a source behind the translucent hemispheres. In this sensory wasteland, something extraordinary begins to happen within your mind. After several minutes of this monotonous sensory input, your brain does not simply accept the emptiness and remain patient. Instead, it becomes restless and desperate, generating increasingly vivid hallucinations in the absence of meaningful external stimulation. You might see geometric patterns, faces, landscapes, or abstract forms materializing before your eyes with striking clarity and emotional intensity. This phenomenon is called the Ganzfeld Effect, and it reveals something profound about how your brain constructs reality rather than merely receiving it. What is occurring is a fundamental breakdown in the boundary between perception and imagination. Your brain evolved in an environment filled with constant, varied sensory input, and it has developed powerful mechanisms to actively seek and process that information. When sensory input becomes uniform and unchanging, the neural systems responsible for visual perception do not simply turn off. Instead, they begin to fire spontaneously, generating internal signals that feel indistinguishable from genuine external perception. The brain interprets these self-generated signals as real visual input, creating what neuroscientists call hallucinations. This is not a malfunction, but rather the normal operation of a system designed for a much richer sensory world. Your consciousness seems to prefer generating phantom experiences over acknowledging emptiness, suggesting that your mind is fundamentally a prediction engine constantly inferring what should be present rather than passively receiving what is. What makes the Ganzfeld effect particularly strange is how deeply it challenges our intuitive sense of perception as a direct window into reality. Consider the moment you glance at a cloud and suddenly see a face staring back at you, complete with eyes and a mouth, or when you notice a pattern of shadows on a wall that resembles a figure watching you in the darkness, or perhaps most famously, when you observe the surface of the moon and recognize the distinct features of a face gazing down at Earth. These experiences are so common and so immediate that we rarely question why our brains insist on finding these familiar forms in randomness. Yet the phenomenon has a name and a thoroughly documented explanation. Pareidolia is the psychological tendency of the human brain to perceive meaningful patterns, particularly faces and figures, within random or ambiguous visual information, and it operates so consistently that nearly every human being experiences it regardless of age, culture, or education level. The mechanism behind this phenomenon roots itself deep within our evolutionary history and the architecture of our visual processing system. As our ancestors who could quickly identify threats, especially other creatures and human faces, survived and reproduced more successfully than those who could not. This neural predisposition became so deeply embedded in our cognitive hardware that we developed an almost hair-trigger sensitivity to facial recognition, meaning our brains will occasionally misfire and perceive faces even when no face actually exists in the visual field. The visual cortex contains specialized regions, particularly the fusiform face area, that activate powerfully whenever we encounter a face. And these regions are so eager to engage that they can be triggered by almost any arrangement of features that remotely approximates the basic structure of two eyes positioned above a nose or mouth. What makes this particularly fascinating is that pareidolia persists with remarkable stubbornness even when we consciously understand that no face is actually present, suggesting that this process operates largely outside our deliberate conscious control and reasoning. Imagine you're scrolling through social media late at night, and you notice that 3 different friends have posted about coffee within the same hour, and then a commercial for a coffee maker appears on your screen, and suddenly you become convinced that the universe is sending you a message about coffee, or that there's some grand conspiracy involving caffeine and your personal destiny. This experience of seeing meaningful connections between unrelated events is called apophenia, and it's one of the most pervasive quirks of human perception that most of us experience without ever knowing its name. Your brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine, evolved over millions of years to detect threats, identify resources, and understand cause and effect in an environment where missing a pattern could mean death. This same neural machinery that allowed your ancestors to recognize a predator's footprints in the underbrush or to understand which plants were safe to eat is the exact same machinery that fires up when you see your ex's name appear 3 times in one day and convince yourself it's fate. The mechanism underlying apophenia is rooted in how your brain processes probability and assigns meaning to coincidence. When you encounter random events, your mind doesn't simply register them as random. Instead, it searches for connections, draws lines between dots, and creates narratives that make sense of the chaos. This happens automatically, without conscious effort, because your brain would rather make a mistake by finding a false pattern than miss a real one that could threaten your survival. What makes apophenia particularly fascinating is that it persists even when we understand intellectually that we're engaging in it. Even when we know that coincidences are statistically inevitable in a world of billions of people and infinite possible events. Even when we can recite the mathematical odds that 3 friends would post about coffee by pure chance alone. Imagine driving on a long, straight highway for hours, mile after mile of asphalt stretching endlessly before you, and suddenly you realize that you have absolutely no memory of the last 30 minutes of driving. Yet you somehow arrived at your exit perfectly. Your hands guided the wheel through turns you don't consciously remember making, and your foot maintained consistent pressure on the pedal without any deliberate thought on your part. This phenomenon, known as highway hypnosis, represents one of the mind's most unsettling yet common experiences, where we perform complex motor tasks with precision and safety, while our conscious awareness seems to have simply disconnected from the process entirely. The experience typically occurs during monotonous driving conditions, particularly on highways with minimal visual variation, predictable traffic patterns, and repetitive environmental stimuli, where the brain essentially enters a state of profound automaticity that feels almost dreamlike in its quality. What happens during highway hypnosis is that your conscious attention, the part of your mind that feels like you, gradually shifts away from the immediate task at hand, allowing your brain's deeply ingrained motor patterns and procedural memory systems to take over completely and manage the driving independently. Your brain has performed the driving task thousands of times before, and these repeated experiences have become so thoroughly encoded in your neural networks that they no longer require conscious supervision or deliberate decision-making to execute properly. The repetitive nature of the driving environment actually encourages this state by providing insufficient stimulation to keep your conscious mind fully engaged, so your awareness drifts toward internal thoughts, daydreams, or a kind of mental blankness rather than remaining focused on the road. Imagine spending several hours playing the video game Tetris, rotating falling blocks and fitting them into perfect lines across the screen, and then closing the game only to find that your mind continues to see those geometric shapes everywhere you look. You glance at a bookshelf and suddenly perceive the volumes as interlocking rectangular pieces waiting to be arranged. You watch clouds drift across the sky and mentally rotate them into configurations that would complete a line. You observe buildings on your city commute and find yourself mentally fitting them together like puzzle blocks. This phenomenon is called the Tetris Effect, and it represents a fascinating quirk of how your brain processes repeated sensory and cognitive patterns. When you engage in an intensely focused activity for an extended period, your mind becomes so attuned to the specific visual patterns and problem-solving mechanics involved that it begins applying that same perceptual framework to unrelated situations in the real world. The neural pathways activated during gameplay remain in a heightened state of readiness, causing your brain to spontaneously search for instances of those patterns in your environment as if the game is still active. This occurs because your brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine, constantly scanning for familiar structures and relationships that match recently reinforced neural networks. The Tetris effect is not limited to video games either, as people report experiencing similar phenomena after playing chess, engaging in data analysis, or even after prolonged exposure to specific professions. A radiologist might see shadows and shapes in everyday objects that resemble potential medical anomalies, or an architect might instinctively analyze the structural integrity and design of buildings they encounter. What makes this effect particularly intriguing is that it persists as a normal and somewhat unremarkable aspect of human cognition despite having no adaptive advantage in modern life. Imagine finding yourself in a dream, moving through impossible landscapes and encountering fantastical scenarios, when suddenly a thought crystallizes in your mind. You realize you are dreaming, and from that moment forward, you possess the remarkable ability to control and manipulate everything around you. You can fly through clouds made of crystalline structures, reshape buildings with a thought, summon people from your past, or create entirely new worlds that obey whatever rules you decide to establish. This experience is called lucid dreaming, and it represents one of the most peculiar states of consciousness that the human brain can produce, occupying a strange middle ground between the unconscious realm of ordinary dreams and the rational awareness of waking life. During most nights, our brains generate dreams through the activation of various neural networks, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and critical analysis, remains essentially offline, which is why dreams feel so real in the moment despite their inherent absurdity. However, during lucid dreams, brain imaging studies reveal something extraordinary. The prefrontal cortex and parietal regions simultaneously activate alongside the areas responsible for visual imagery and emotional processing, creating a hybrid state where rational awareness coexists with the dream machinery. This neurological paradox allows people to maintain conscious thought and decision-making abilities while their sensory cortex continues to generate the vivid, immersive experience of a dream environment. Research suggests that certain individuals can train themselves to achieve lucidity through reality checks and intention-setting practices, essentially teaching their brains to recognize the inconsistencies and illogical elements that characterize dreams. When you drift into sleep and find yourself navigating the strange landscapes of your dreams, you encounter people, friends, strangers, family members, and mysterious figures whose names you cannot quite remember. Yet despite the vast population of the world containing billions of unique faces, your dreaming mind almost never creates entirely new ones from nothing, instead recycling and recombining the faces you have already seen in waking life. Drawing from your personal catalog of remembered appearances to populate your nocturnal narratives. Neuroscientists and dream researchers have observed this peculiar phenomenon repeatedly through studies where people describe their dreams in detail. And when questioned about the faces they encountered, subjects consistently report that upon reflection, nearly every face they dreamed about belonged to someone they had actually seen before, whether that person was significant to their life or merely someone glimpsed in passing on a street or in the background of a photograph years earlier. The mechanism behind this strange recycling appears to stem from how human memory and visual processing actually function during sleep. As your brain lacks the generative capacity to spontaneously construct entirely novel facial features and proportions in the way it might theoretically be capable of doing, instead defaulting to the most efficient neurological pathway, which involves retrieving and reassembling existing facial data already stored in your long-term memory banks. This suggests that your dreaming imagination, despite feeling boundless and creative in the moment, operates within strict constraints shaped by what your waking mind has already encountered and cataloged, meaning your subconscious creative process is fundamentally parasitic on your actual life experience rather than truly generative. As you drift towards sleep, suspended in that peculiar liminal space between wakefulness and unconsciousness, your mind occasionally produces vivid sensory experiences that feel entirely real in the moment yet vanish the instant you fully awaken. You might see shadowy figures moving across your bedroom, hear your name called out by a familiar voice, or feel the distinct sensation of falling through empty space, jolting you back to consciousness with your heart racing and your body tense. These experiences, known as hypnagogic hallucinations, occur during the transition into sleep and represent one of the most common yet profoundly disorienting phenomena that human brains generate without any external stimulus to justify them. The hallucinations can take virtually any sensory form imaginable, from visual apparitions to tactile sensations to complex auditory experiences, and they feel so convincing to the experiencing person that many individuals spend considerable mental energy trying to determine whether what they witnessed was genuinely present in their room or merely a trick of their deteriorating consciousness. The mechanism behind these hallucinations lies in the unique neurological state that occurs during the transition between sleep stages, when your brain begins to produce the slower brainwave patterns associated with sleep, while your sensory cortex remains partially engaged and your critical thinking faculties have not yet fully disengaged. During this threshold period, your brain essentially begins generating the internal imagery and sensations that normally accompany dreams. Yet your consciousness remains just aware enough to perceive these self-generated experiences as if they were coming from the external environment rather than being created by your own neural activity. Additionally, during this state, your brain experiences a dramatic reduction in the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which normally helps regulate sensory perception and maintain your sense of reality, leaving your mind more susceptible to misinterpreting its own internal activity as external phenomena. Imagine sitting down to write a poem, compose a melody, or develop what you believe to be an entirely original idea, only to discover months or years later that you encountered nearly identical words, phrases, or concepts somewhere in your distant past, perhaps in a book you read in childhood or a conversation you overheard at a party you barely remember. This phenomenon, known as cryptomnesia, represents one of the mind's most unsettling paradoxes: the ability to unconsciously retrieve and reproduce information from memory while simultaneously believing that you have created something entirely new. The experience feels authentic and original in the moment of creation, yet the source material was lurking in your brain all along, waiting to resurface without your conscious awareness or permission. What makes cryptomnesia particularly fascinating is that it is not a failure of memory, but rather a peculiar success of memory operating beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Your brain has retained information perfectly, cataloged it completely, and integrated it into your knowledge base. Yet when you access that information to generate your supposedly original work, your conscious mind has no recollection of where it came from. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the distinction between explicit memory, which is conscious and deliberately recalled, and implicit memory, which operates automatically and without conscious effort. When you create something you believe to be original, you're drawing upon both types of memory simultaneously, but your conscious mind experiences only the act of creation itself, not the retrieval of pre-existing material from implicit stores. This disconnect creates a genuine illusion of originality because your awareness focuses on the moment of expression rather than the moment of retrieval. Despite the logical impossibility of truly knowing whether any of your thoughts are completely original or merely recombinations of encountered material, we persist in celebrating and defining ourselves through our creative outputs as if they emerged from nowhere. Imagine sitting in a therapist's office and suddenly remembering a traumatic event from your childhood that you had completely forgotten, an experience so vivid and emotionally overwhelming that it feels absolutely real. Yet when you later speak with family members about this memory, they have no recollection of it ever happening, and in fact they can prove that you were not even present at the location where this memory supposedly occurred. This phenomenon, known as false memory, represents one of the most unsettling truths about human cognition, revealing that our memories are not reliable recordings of past events, but rather reconstructive processes that can be fundamentally altered, contaminated, or entirely fabricated by suggestion, emotion, imagination, and the simple act of repeatedly telling ourselves a story about what we believe happened. The mechanism behind false memories operates through several interconnected psychological processes, beginning with the malleability of memory itself, which is not stored as a fixed file, but rather reconstructed each time we recall it, meaning that every time you remember something, you are actually rebuilding that memory from fragmented pieces and filling in gaps with assumptions, details borrowed from other experiences, or information you learned after the event itself. When a therapist asks leading questions during memory recovery sessions, they can inadvertently plant suggestions that become incorporated into memory, or when family members repeatedly tell you stories about your childhood, you may eventually internalize those stories as direct personal memories rather than second-hand accounts. And when you imagine hypothetical scenarios vividly enough, your brain can struggle to distinguish between what you imagined and what actually happened. The Mandela Effect is a fascinating phenomenon where large groups of people share identical false memories of events, facts, or details that never actually occurred or happened differently than remembered. And the term itself originated from the widespread collective misremembering of Nelson Mandela's death, as many people distinctly recalled that he died in prison during the 1980s when in reality he was released, became president of South Africa, and lived until 2013. This peculiar psychological occurrence has spawned countless examples that persist across millions of individuals who have no connection to one another, such as the famous Berenstain Bears, which was actually always spelled Berenstain, or the belief that there exists a cornucopia in the fruit of the loom logo when there definitively never was one, or the common false memory that the Monopoly man wears a monocle when examining the original artwork reveals he never did. The mechanism behind this collective misremembering operates through several interconnected cognitive processes, primarily source confusion, where our brains fail to properly encode the origin of information, combined with the power of suggestion and social reinforcement, where hearing others confidently assert false details actually strengthens our conviction in those false memories rather than weakening it. Our brains are not recording devices, but rather reconstructive systems that piece together narratives from fragments, filling in gaps with assumptions and expectations, and when multiple people fill those gaps identically through similar cultural references or logical assumptions, the false memory becomes mutually reinforcing and increasingly difficult to distinguish from reality. Consider the moment you first heard about a significant historical event or experienced a deeply emotional occurrence in your own life, and notice how certain details feel permanently seared into your consciousness with photographic clarity. You can remember exactly where you were standing, what the weather felt like, who told you the news, what you were wearing, and even the precise quality of light in the room, as though your mind had taken a perfect snapshot of that instant and preserved it unchanged for years or even decades. These are flashbulb memories, and they possess a remarkable quality of seeming absolutely certain and vivid, creating the conviction that you are recalling something with perfect accuracy, while the surrounding events of that day fade into fog and obscurity. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves a neurological response to emotionally significant or shocking information, wherein your amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, essentially marks the moment as important and floods your consciousness with norepinephrine and other neurochemicals that heighten attention and encoding. Your brain essentially prioritizes the storage of peripheral details surrounding the emotionally salient moment rather than necessarily storing the information itself with greater accuracy. So the vivid sensory context feels more reliable than it actually is. Yet here exists a peculiar disconnect that researchers have documented with surprising consistency. When people are asked about these flashbulb memories weeks, months, or years later, their accounts change in significant ways, details transform, and the core facts themselves sometimes prove demonstrably incorrect, despite the experiencer's absolute certainty and emotional conviction about their accuracy. Consider the peculiar way your memory organizes itself across the span of your lifetime, where certain years seem to stand out with crystalline clarity while others fade into a murky blur of forgotten moments. If you were to sit down and list your most vivid and meaningful memories, you would likely discover that a disproportionate number of them cluster around a specific period of your life, typically falling somewhere between the ages of 15 and 30, and this phenomenon is known as the Reminiscence Bump. This is not merely a matter of those years being objectively more exciting or important, but rather a documented cognitive pattern where individuals consistently report stronger memories and more autobiographical details from this particular window of adolescence and early adulthood than from any other comparable period, including the years immediately before or after. Psychologists have studied this effect extensively across cultures and generations, finding that it emerges reliably even when people are asked to recall events from throughout their entire lives, and the memories from this bump tend to be not just more numerous, but also more emotionally significant and detailed. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to involve several intersecting factors, including the biological reality that the adolescent and young adult brain is still developing its memory consolidation systems, while simultaneously experiencing intense emotional experiences and major life events such as first relationships, educational achievements, and the formation of core identity elements. Additionally, during these years, individuals are often establishing many of their fundamental beliefs, values, and personality traits, which means that events occurring during this period become deeply encoded as meaningful turning points rather than routine occurrences. Imagine you're at a dinner party and a friend mentions a fascinating fact about how octopuses have 3 hearts, and you find yourself genuinely impressed by this piece of information, turning to others at the table to share this remarkable biological detail. Days later, that same fact surfaces in your mind again, and you confidently relay it to someone else as though you discovered it yourself, completely forgetting that your friend was the original source of this knowledge. This phenomenon is called source amnesia, and it represents one of the most perplexing disconnects between what we remember and how we remember it. Source amnesia occurs when we retain information but lose the memory of where that information came from, essentially divorcing the content from its context. Our brains store facts, ideas, and knowledge in one neural location, while the metadata about their origin gets filed away in a separate system, and sometimes that second system simply fails to retrieve what it needs to retrieve. The mechanism behind this operates through the distinction between explicit and implicit memory, where we can perfectly recall the substance of what we learned, while the circumstances surrounding that learning remain completely inaccessible to our conscious awareness. What makes source amnesia particularly strange is that it happens with remarkable frequency, despite the fact that our brains are ostensibly designed to remember everything that matters. Yet we've normalized this quirk so thoroughly that we rarely question it. We've all unknowingly repeated someone else's joke as our own, cited information we read somewhere, without remembering where, or felt convinced we witnessed something that we only heard about secondhand. And this happens because the brain prioritizes information retention over source tracking, treating the origin of knowledge as less important than the knowledge itself. An evolutionary trade-off that made sense when survival depended on knowing facts rather than knowing footnotes. Imagine yourself sitting at your desk, working through a list of tasks for the day, when suddenly a colleague interrupts you with an urgent question, pulling your attention away from what you were doing, and you never return to complete that original task before the day ends. Hours later, as you lie in bed trying to fall asleep, your mind inexplicably drifts back to that unfinished work, replaying it in vivid detail, dwelling on what you didn't accomplish, unable to simply let it go and move forward. This persistent mental preoccupation with incomplete tasks is known as the Zeigarnik Effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first documented this phenomenon in the 1920s. In her original experiments, Zeigarnik gave subjects various tasks to complete, and then interrupted them partway through, only to allow other subjects to finish their tasks without interruption. When later asked to recall the tasks they had performed, the interrupted subjects remembered significantly more details about the tasks they never completed compared to the tasks they had successfully finished, demonstrating that our brains appear to maintain an active, nagging memory of unresolved matters. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through what psychologists call the open-loop phenomenon, wherein the human mind treats incomplete actions as cognitively unfinished business, automatically allocating mental resources to keep these open loops accessible in memory, ready to be resumed whenever the opportunity arises. Our brains essentially mark these tasks as priority items that demand closure, and this mental marking persists until the task is either completed or deliberately abandoned with conscious intention. What makes the Zeigarnik effect particularly fascinating is how it continues to influence our behavior despite our modern understanding of it, as we remain seemingly unable to override this ancient cognitive mechanism through sheer willpower or logic alone, suggesting that this tendency served some evolutionary advantage for our ancestors, perhaps ensuring that important survival tasks were never forgotten or neglected. Have you ever experienced that peculiar sensation of knowing something with absolute certainty, yet being completely unable to retrieve it from your mind in that moment? You know the word, you can almost feel it sitting there on the very edge of your consciousness. You might even know what letter it starts with or how many syllables it contains, yet the actual word itself remains frustratingly inaccessible. This phenomenon is called the tip of the tongue state, and it represents one of the most common and maddening experiences of human cognition. When you find yourself in this state, you are aware that you possess the information, you have confidence in its existence somewhere within your neural networks, but the retrieval pathway has become mysteriously blocked, creating an almost physical sensation of something being right there but not quite accessible. The psychological mechanism behind this strange experience lies in the way memory is organized and retrieved within the brain. Your memory is not like a library where you can simply walk to a shelf and pull out the exact book you need, but rather a complex network of interconnected associations and pathways that must be activated in sequence to surface information. When you cannot retrieve a specific word or fact, it is often because you have accessed related memories and partial information about that word without successfully activating the complete neural representation that contains the word itself. You might remember semantic information about the concept, its general category or context, even phonetic details about how it sounds, but the complete lexical entry remains frustratingly dormant. Neuroscientists believe this occurs because memory encoding and retrieval are not unitary processes, but rather depend on multiple independent systems working together. What makes this phenomenon particularly bizarre is that despite our advanced understanding of neuroscience and cognitive psychology, we have no reliable mechanism to force resolution of the tip of the tongue state. Have you ever found yourself humming the same melody over and over again, unable to stop even though you desperately want to, even though hours have passed, and the song has long since stopped playing in any external environment around you, stuck repeating the same few bars endlessly in the theater of your mind, as though your brain has become a broken record player trapped in an infinite loop? This peculiar phenomenon, which scientists formally call involuntary musical imagery, but which most people simply refer to as having a song stuck in your head, or an earworm, is one of the most common experiences of human consciousness, affecting roughly 90% of people at least once per week, yet it remains one of the most mysteriously persistent quirks of how our brains actually function. The mechanism behind earworms appears to involve the auditory cortex and the motor regions of the brain simultaneously activating, creating a kind of neurological feedback loop where the same neural pathways fire repeatedly, essentially playing back the musical memory without any external stimulus needed, as if your brain has created its own internal jukebox that cannot be turned off by conscious will alone. What makes earworms particularly fascinating and somewhat bizarre is that they tend to attach themselves most readily to songs that are simple, repetitive, have an unusual structure or rhythm that your brain finds slightly unpredictable, or that you have heard recently, but perhaps not heard completely from beginning to end, leaving your mind unsatisfied and desperately seeking closure by replaying the fragment eternally. Imagine yourself standing in a crowded room filled with dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, a cacophony of overlapping voices and laughter and clinking glasses, a sensory environment so chaotic that it should be impossible to focus on anything at all, and yet somehow you find yourself able to track the specific conversation happening directly in front of you, filtering out all the ambient noise around you as if someone had simply turned down the volume on everything else in the room. And then perhaps someone across the room mentions your name, and suddenly your attention snaps to that distant conversation even though you were deeply engaged elsewhere, as if your mind has been running a constant background search for that particular word or voice the entire time. This is the cocktail party effect, and it reveals something profoundly strange about how your brain actually allocates attention and processes sound. Your auditory system is not actually filtering out the competing voices in the way you consciously perceive it to be, because research has shown that your brain is in fact processing information from all those background conversations simultaneously, extracting meaning from conversations you are not consciously aware of hearing, monitoring them for personally relevant information like your own name or words associated with danger or threat or emotional significance, all while you maintain the subjective experience of focusing narrowly on one conversation. The mechanism seems to involve a combination of what neuroscientists call selective attention and what they describe as an automatic orienting response, whereby your brain assigns priority to certain acoustic information based on learned patterns and personal relevance, allowing you to consciously perceive a narrow bandwidth of the auditory environment while maintaining an unconscious surveillance system across everything else happening around you. Imagine sitting in front of a computer screen where you see the word red printed in blue ink, and your task is simply to name the color of the ink rather than read the word itself. Your brain already knows how to read fluently, so when you encounter this simple visual stimulus, something peculiar happens. Your eyes take longer to respond, your reaction time slows dramatically, and you may even stumble over your answer despite the task being fundamentally easy. This cognitive phenomenon is called the Stroop Effect, named after John Ridley Stroop, who first documented it in 1935, and it represents one of the most robust demonstrations of how automaticity and conscious intention can collide within the human mind. The effect occurs because reading has become such an automatic process through years of practice that your brain processes written words almost involuntarily, often before you can even direct your attention toward the actual color of the ink. When the word and its color match, there is no conflict, and you respond quickly and accurately. But when they conflict, your brain must suppress the automatic reading response and override it with the intentional color naming response, creating a bottleneck in your cognitive processing. This interference reveals something profound about how your mind has organized itself. Skills that once required tremendous conscious effort eventually become automatic, running in the background like invisible processes that you cannot simply switch off when you want to. What makes the Stroop effect particularly fascinating is that knowing about it in advance, understanding exactly why it happens, and even practicing it repeatedly does not eliminate the effect substantially. You cannot simply decide to stop reading automatically, because that skill is now encoded so deeply within your neural architecture that it operates independently of your conscious will. This demonstrates that consciousness and automatic processing exist in an uneasy partnership, where your deliberate intentions must constantly negotiate with the learned patterns your brain has reinforced over a lifetime. Imagine being shown two abstract shapes on a screen, one soft and rounded with flowing curves that seem to bubble outward in all directions, and another sharp and angular with jagged points protruding at irregular intervals. You are then asked a simple question: which one is Bouba and which one is Kiki? Despite having no rational basis for your answer, despite the fact that these are merely nonsense syllables paired with meaningless visual forms, your mind generates an immediate and almost involuntary response, and you are almost certainly not alone in that response. This phenomenon, first documented by psychologist Wolfgang Kerchler in the 1920s, and formally named the Bouba-Kiki Effect by Vilyaner Ramachandran decades later, reveals something profound about how your brain processes language and perceives the world around you. The soft, rounded shape is almost universally called Bauba, while the sharp, angular form is overwhelmingly identified as Kiki, and this pattern holds remarkably consistent across cultures, age groups, and even among people who have never encountered these specific syllables before. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to involve a process called synesthesia-like cross-activation, where the sounds we hear trigger automatic associations with visual and tactile sensations in our minds, creating unexpected neural pathways that connect seemingly unrelated domains of perception. The sound of Bauba, with its rounded vowels and soft consonants, somehow mirrors the gentle curves of the rounded shape, while Kiki, with its sharp K sounds and clipped vowels, resonates with the jagged, piercing quality of the angular form. This suggests that language itself may be fundamentally shaped by the physical properties of sound and our embodied experience of the world, rather than being purely arbitrary and abstract as linguists long assumed. There exists a peculiar phenomenon where the physical act of moving your facial muscles in a particular configuration can actually influence your emotional state, meaning that if you deliberately force your face into the shape of a smile, your brain will begin to interpret this muscular arrangement as evidence that you are actually happy, which then causes your neurochemistry to shift accordingly and produce genuine feelings of pleasure and contentment. This counterintuitive process has been demonstrated repeatedly in psychological research, where participants who were asked to hold a pencil between their teeth in a way that naturally produces a smile reported feeling more amused while watching funny videos than those who held the pencil in a way that created a frown, suggesting that your body is sending constant signals to your brain about your emotional state based on what your face is doing. The mechanism appears to work through a combination of factors, including the fact that your facial muscles have proprioceptors, which are sensory receptors that communicate information about muscle position and tension to your brain, and this feedback travels through neural pathways that overlap significantly with the emotional processing centers in your limbic system, creating a bidirectional loop where emotions cause facial expressions, but facial expressions also cause emotions. What makes this discovery genuinely strange is the realization that our emotions are not purely top-down phenomena originating in our minds, but rather involve constant feedback from our bodies. Yet despite understanding this process intellectually, we persist in believing that our feelings arise solely from our thoughts and circumstances, when in reality something as simple as consciously adjusting the position of your mouth can meaningfully alter your psychological state, suggesting that we have far less separation between our physical form and our mental experience than we typically assume, and that the boundary between genuine emotion and performed emotion may be far more blurred than our intuitive understanding would suggest. Imagine you are walking across a tall, swaying suspension bridge high above a ravine when you encounter an attractive stranger who asks if you would like to grab coffee sometime. Your heart is racing, your palms are sweating, and you feel an overwhelming sense of excitement and attraction to this person. You eagerly exchange contact information and spend the evening replaying the interaction in your mind, convinced that you have met someone truly special. What you may not realize, however, is that much of what you interpreted as romantic attraction was actually the physical arousal triggered by the bridge itself, the height, the danger, and the adrenaline flooding your system. This phenomenon is called misattribution of arousal, and it is one of the most deceptive tricks your brain plays on itself. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. Your body produces physical symptoms of arousal in response to many different stimuli, whether that stimulus is genuine romantic interest, fear, exercise, caffeine, or environmental stress. Yet your conscious mind, which is constantly searching for explanations and narratives to make sense of your experiences, often assigns these physical sensations to the most salient or convenient source available, rather than to their actual origin. When your heart is pounding and your adrenaline is elevated, your brain reaches for the most obvious explanation in your immediate environment, and if an attractive person happens to be present, your mind rapidly constructs a story of romantic chemistry. This misattribution process happens automatically and unconsciously, which means you have almost no awareness that it is occurring, and you cannot easily correct it even when you know the mechanism exists. We find ourselves vulnerable to this bias repeatedly throughout our lives, mistaking nervousness for excitement, misinterpreting the effects of loud music or bright lights at a nightclub for genuine connection, and confusing the adrenaline of a shared thrilling experience with deeper emotional bonding. Imagine walking into a room where everyone is laughing at a joke you didn't hear, and within moments, you find yourself smiling and laughing along despite having no idea what was actually funny. Or consider sitting in a meeting where one person begins to panic about a deadline, and suddenly, the entire team's anxiety levels spike in tandem, spreading through the group like an invisible current that nobody consciously decided to experience. This phenomenon is called emotional contagion, and it describes the remarkable and somewhat unsettling way that emotions transfer between people without any direct communication or conscious effort on anyone's part. You absorb the emotional states of those around you through a complex blend of mirror neurons, facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and subtle chemical signals, essentially catching feelings the way you might catch a cold from someone sneezing nearby. Your brain contains specialized neurons called mirror neurons that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that same action, creating an automatic neural pathway that makes you unconsciously mimic the expressions and emotional states of people near you. When someone smiles genuinely, the muscles around their eyes crinkle in a particular way, and your face automatically replicates that same configuration without your permission or awareness, which in turn triggers the same emotional feedback in your brain that produces genuine happiness in them. This process happens within milliseconds, far too quickly for conscious deliberation, and it means that emotional states can ripple through crowds, families, and workplaces like waves moving through water, with individuals genuinely feeling emotions they never chose to experience. When you watch someone yawn, you often feel the urge to yawn yourself, even though you were not tired moments before, and when you observe a skilled dancer moving across a stage, your muscles subtly activate in patterns that mirror their movements without you consciously deciding to move. And when you see someone touch a hot stove and recoil in pain, you experience a phantom sensation of heat and discomfort in your own hand, despite knowing intellectually that you are safe and far away from any source of heat. These experiences are orchestrated by a remarkable system within your brain called mirror neurons, which are specialized cells discovered in the early 1990s that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that same action, essentially creating a neural simulation of another person's behavior within your own mind. The mechanism operates through a kind of automatic mirroring that happens beneath conscious awareness, allowing you to understand other people's intentions and emotions not through logical analysis or explicit instruction, but through a direct neural resonance that makes their actions feel somehow familiar to your own motor system, and this same neural machinery is believed to underpin your capacity for empathy, allowing you to feel what others feel by literally enacting their experiences in miniature within your own brain. Imagine a patient suffering from chronic pain, anxiety, or insomnia walking into a clinic where they are given a small pill and told with absolute certainty that it will relieve their symptoms, when in reality that pill contains nothing but sugar or an inert substance with no pharmacological properties whatsoever. And yet within hours or days, the patient genuinely experiences relief from their condition, reporting decreased pain levels, improved mood, and better sleep quality. All because their mind has somehow convinced their body that healing has begun. This is the placebo effect, one of the most perplexing phenomena in medical science, where the expectation of treatment becomes nearly as powerful as the treatment itself. The mechanism behind this strange truth appears to operate through multiple interconnected pathways within the brain and body, beginning with expectation and belief triggering the release of neurochemicals like endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin, which can genuinely alter pain perception, mood, and even immune function, demonstrating that the boundary between mind and body is far more permeable than most people realize. When the brain anticipates healing, it activates specific neural networks associated with reward and relief, and simultaneously, the body's stress response system downregulates, lowering cortisol levels and allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to promote genuine physiological changes that can reduce inflammation and accelerate certain healing processes. Imagine a patient sitting in a doctor's office who receives a prescription for a new medication, and before they even take the first dose, the physician carefully lists every possible side effect that might occur, from mild headaches to severe nausea and dizziness, and then something remarkable happens within the patient's body and mind. They begin experiencing many of those exact symptoms, not because the medication has truly caused them, but because their expectation of suffering has literally transformed their physiology into a state of suffering. This phenomenon is known as the Nocebo Effect, and it represents one of the most peculiar and troubling demonstrations of how powerfully the human mind can betray itself through the simple act of anticipating harm. The nocebo effect operates through the same neurological pathways as its famous counterpart, the placebo effect, except where placebo generates healing through positive expectation, nocebo generates genuine symptoms and dysfunction through negative expectation and the anxiety that accompanies it. When we believe that something harmful will happen to our bodies, our nervous system responds by releasing stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, our muscles tense reflexively, our breathing becomes shallow, and our immune function actually shifts into a defensive state that can produce inflammation and genuine physical discomfort. The brain essentially creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the mere suggestion of illness becomes indistinguishable from actual illness in terms of the real biological changes occurring within our tissues and organs. What makes this effect so remarkable is that it persists even in individuals who are intellectually aware of how the nocebo effect works, suggesting that our rational understanding of a phenomenon provides almost no protection against our deeper automatic responses to threat and expectation. Your eyes contain a small area where the optic nerve connects to the retina, and in this location there are no light-sensitive cells at all, which means that every single person walking around on this planet has a genuine blind spot in their visual field, a small void where nothing should theoretically be visible. Yet you have never noticed it, and you probably never will because your brain has developed an extraordinary and unsettling ability to simply fill in that missing information without your knowledge or consent. When light from the world enters your eye and hits this blind spot, no signal travels to your brain, no information arrives, and yet your mind does not perceive darkness or a gap or an absence. Instead, it reconstructs what it assumes should be there based on the surrounding visual context, effectively inventing details that you never actually saw. If you are looking at a wall, your brain fills the blind spot with wall. If you are looking at a face, it fills the blind spot with whatever facial features would logically continue in that space. If you are looking at a pattern, it completes the pattern seamlessly, as though your eye had captured every photon. This process happens continuously throughout your waking life, without generating any conscious awareness of the deception, and the mechanism underlying it appears to be a form of predictive processing, where your brain does not passively receive visual information, but instead actively constructs your perception of reality based on expectations and contextual clues and past experiences. The truly unsettling aspect of this phenomenon is that it reveals how much of what you believe you are seeing is actually your brain's best guess rather than direct sensory input. And yet we proceed through life with complete confidence in the accuracy of our perception, unaware that we are constantly experiencing a constructed reality rather than objective truth. Imagine standing in a garden at dusk, surrounded by red roses and blue flowers, and as the sun dips lower on the horizon, something peculiar begins to happen to your perception without you consciously noticing it at all. The red roses, which appeared so vibrant and dominant moments before, seem to fade into a darker, less saturated hue, while the blue flowers suddenly appear to brighten and become more prominent in your visual field, even though the actual wavelengths of light reflecting from these objects have not fundamentally changed in any meaningful way. This phenomenon, first documented by Czech physiologist Jan Evangelista Purkinje in the 1800s, reveals something profoundly strange about how human vision operates at different levels of illumination. When light levels decrease and your eyes transition from photopic vision, which relies on cone cells in the retina that perceive color most effectively in bright conditions, to scotopic vision, which depends on rod cells that are far more sensitive to dim light but cannot distinguish color, your entire perception of the color spectrum shifts dramatically. Red wavelengths, which activate cones most effectively during daylight, become increasingly invisible as illumination fades, while blue and green wavelengths, which stimulate rod cells more efficiently, appear to gain relative brightness and saturation. The biological mechanism behind this shift involves the different spectral sensitivities of cones and rods, with rod cells peaking in sensitivity around 407 nanometers in the blue range, whereas cone cells peak around 555 nanometers in the yellow-green range. Despite understanding this phenomenon scientifically for more than a century and a half, we continue to be surprised and occasionally disoriented when it happens in our daily lives, as our brains struggle to reconcile the logical knowledge of what should be happening with the visceral experience of watching familiar colors transform before our eyes into something almost unrecognizable. Imagine possessing a visual ability so rare that fewer than 1% of the human population will ever experience it, a neurological gift that allows you to see colors that exist in a dimension completely invisible to everyone around you. And yet most people who possess this extraordinary capacity spend their entire lives completely unaware that they even have it. This is the phenomenon of tetrachromacy, a condition where certain individuals, predominantly women, are born with 4 types of color receptors in their eyes instead of the typical 3, which theoretically grants them the ability to distinguish between millions of additional color variations that remain forever hidden to the vast majority of humanity. The mechanism behind this remarkable difference lies in the genetics of cone cells within the retina, specifically in how the photopigment genes are arranged on the X chromosome. And because women possess 2 X chromosomes while men possess only 1, the mathematical probability of tetrachromacy occurring is exponentially higher in females, though the condition remains extraordinarily uncommon even among women. When a woman inherits 2 slightly different versions of the red cone photopigment gene on each of her 2 X chromosomes, she develops a 4th type of cone cell that sits somewhere between red and green on the visible spectrum, theoretically allowing her brain to process color information with a sensitivity and nuance that creates an entirely separate universe of visual experience. Yet despite decades of scientific research and the theoretical understanding of this capability, the vast majority of tetrachromats have never been formally identified, never undergone testing, and continue moving through life completely unaware that their personal experience of color is fundamentally different from everyone else's, living in a strange state of isolation where the richness of their visual world cannot be adequately communicated to others. Since there are simply no words in any human language to describe colors that do not exist in the common visual lexicon. Have you ever noticed a word, phrase, or concept you just learned suddenly appearing everywhere around you, as though the universe conspired to place it directly in your path at every possible moment? Perhaps you learned about a rare car model, and suddenly you see that exact vehicle parked on your street 3 times within a single week, or you discover a new musical artist and inexplicably hear their song on the radio twice the following day. This phenomenon is called the frequency illusion, and it represents one of the most pervasive tricks your brain plays on itself, creating the false sensation that something has become dramatically more common when in reality nothing has changed except your awareness of it. The mechanism behind this illusion operates through a cognitive process known as selective attention combined with confirmation bias, where your mind, having been primed to notice something specific, begins actively scanning your environment for that target with heightened vigilance. Once you have encoded a particular piece of information into your active awareness, your brain essentially places a spotlight on that category of things, and suddenly all instances of it become visible to you in a way they never were before, even though those instances were always present in the world around you. The frequency illusion demonstrates how our minds are not passive observers of reality, but rather active constructors of experience, filtering and highlighting information based on what we are currently thinking about and what we have recently learned. This illusion persists despite being completely logical once explained, suggesting that even with full awareness of how the mechanism works, we remain fundamentally unable to disable this aspect of our perceptual machinery, as though our consciousness cannot override the automatic processes that govern what captures our attention and what remains invisible in the crowded landscape of stimuli surrounding us. Imagine yourself walking into a crowded coffee shop with a visible stain on your shirt, or perhaps you trip slightly as you enter a busy hallway at work, and for a moment you feel as though every eye in the vicinity has turned toward you, every person has noticed your mistake, and your embarrassment becomes amplified by the perceived intensity of their collective attention. This phenomenon is called the spotlight effect, and it describes our deeply ingrained tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice us, our appearance, our behavior, and our social missteps. We genuinely believe that we are standing under an intense spotlight of social scrutiny, when in reality we occupy only a peripheral position in most people's awareness. The mechanism behind this cognitive bias operates through what psychologists call egocentric bias, which is our natural inclination to view the world primarily through the lens of our own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Because we are acutely aware of our own appearance and actions at all times, constantly monitoring ourselves and our presentation, we assume that others must be equally focused on observing us with the same level of detail and intensity. We forget that other people are so preoccupied with their own self-consciousness, their own worries about how they appear, and their own internal narratives that they barely register our existence at all. Research has consistently demonstrated that people remember far less about our appearance and behavior than we believe they do, yet this knowledge rarely penetrates deeply enough to change our behavior in the moment. We persist in this illusion despite logical understanding, because our immediate emotional experience feels so vivid and real that abstract statistical knowledge cannot compete with the raw sensation of being watched. Imagine sitting across from a fortune teller or a psychic who tells you that you have a deep need for other people to like and admire you, yet you tend to be critical of yourself, that you have unused potential, or that while you present a confident exterior, you harbor secret doubts and fears. The experience feels deeply personal, like this stranger has somehow glimpsed into your soul and understood something fundamental about your character. You leave the reading feeling validated, seen, and convinced of their remarkable insight into the human condition. Yet here is the peculiar truth. The exact same statements were also delivered verbatim to every other person who visited that same practitioner that week, and nearly all of them reported feeling equally recognized and understood. This is the Barnum Effect, named after showman P.T. Barnum, who famously said there is a sucker born every minute, though the effect itself reveals something far more nuanced about human psychology than simple gullibility. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what psychologists call personal validation bias combined with the Forer effect, which describes our tendency to accept vague, general statements as specifically meaningful to our own lives. The statements in these readings are intentionally crafted to be universally true yet specific enough in their emotional resonance to feel like personalized insights. They exploit a fundamental truth about human consciousness. We are pattern-seeking creatures desperate to find meaning, and when presented with ambiguous information, we automatically fill in the gaps with our own experiences, our own fears, and our own desires. When someone tells you that you desire achievement but fear failure, they have described nearly every human being alive, yet each listener feels uniquely understood because they superimpose their particular context onto those general words. What makes this effect persist despite our general awareness of its existence is that emotional resonance trumps logical analysis in our brains. Imagine a person who has just learned their first 3 guitar chords confidently declaring they could teach others to play within weeks, or someone who has skimmed a few articles about quantum physics suddenly feeling qualified to debate with actual physicists about the nature of reality itself. This phenomenon is so common that we encounter it almost daily in our modern world, whether in social media comment sections, where amateur enthusiasts declare absolute certainties about complex topics, or in workplace meetings, where the least experienced team member speaks with the most unwavering conviction. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes this peculiar cognitive bias where people with low levels of knowledge or skill in a particular domain tend to overestimate their competence, while simultaneously experiencing a kind of blindness toward the vast landscape of information and nuance they have not yet encountered. The mechanism behind this effect operates through a double burden. First, the person lacks sufficient knowledge to understand how much they do not know, and second, the very skills required to accurately assess one's own competence are the same skills that one must develop through deeper learning and experience. When someone is genuinely incompetent in a field, they simply do not possess the cognitive tools necessary to recognize the gaps in their understanding, making them paradoxically confident in their wrongness. Conversely, as people gain genuine expertise and become deeply familiar with a subject, they often experience a dip in confidence as they begin to perceive the complexity, the exceptions, the nuances, and the vast territories of unknowing that lie before them. What makes this effect particularly persistent in human psychology is that it does not require malice or stupidity to manifest. It is a natural consequence of how human cognition works, an inevitable byproduct of learning that persists even when we are explicitly told about it, and even when we believe ourselves immune to its influence, which is perhaps the most ironic twist of all. Consider for a moment the results of any survey asking people to rate their own driving ability. their intelligence, their attractiveness, or their moral character, and you will immediately encounter a phenomenon so pervasive that it shapes nearly every human interaction and self-assessment we make. The vast majority of people, studies consistently show around 80 to 90% of respondents, rank themselves as above average in these categories, which is, of course, mathematically impossible since, by definition, only half of any population can be above average. This cognitive bias, known as illusory superiority or the Lake-Wobegon effect, causes us to systematically overestimate our own positive qualities while simultaneously underestimating our negative ones, creating a persistent and comfortable illusion of personal superiority that most of us carry throughout our entire lives. The mechanism behind this bias operates through several psychological pathways working in concert, beginning with our inherent tendency to focus more on our own positive attributes and intentions rather than our shortcomings. Since we experience our own thoughts, efforts, and circumstances in rich detail while observing others only through their external behaviors and visible mistakes. We tend to attribute our successes to our own intelligence and character while blaming our failures on external circumstances and bad luck. Yet we reverse this process entirely when observing others, crediting their successes to fortunate timing and external factors while attributing their failures to personal flaws and insufficient effort. Additionally, we have access to abundant evidence of our own good intentions. We know when we tried hard, when we acted out of kindness, when we made genuine mistakes. But we observe only the final outcomes and visible behaviors of others, leading us to judge them more harshly and completely than we would ever judge ourselves. Imagine you have developed a strong belief about something, perhaps that a certain political candidate is dishonest, or that a particular diet is the best way to lose weight, or that people of a certain profession are inherently lazy, and from that moment forward, your mind begins a subtle but powerful filtering operation that most people never consciously recognize. When you encounter information that supports your existing belief, you absorb it readily, you remember it vividly, you share it with others, and you consider it compelling evidence that you were right all along. However, when you encounter information that directly contradicts your belief, something remarkable happens in your neural architecture. You scrutinize it more harshly, you demand higher standards of evidence, you find reasons to doubt its validity, you forget it more easily, and you rarely mention it to anyone. This phenomenon is called confirmation bias, and it is one of the most pervasive distortions in human thinking, affecting everyone from the most brilliant scientists to the most humble individuals going about their daily lives. The mechanism underlying confirmation bias appears to be rooted in how your brain allocates cognitive resources and maintains what researchers call cognitive coherence, which is essentially the comfortable feeling that your various beliefs fit together in a harmonious, logical way. Your brain is constantly trying to minimize the uncomfortable emotional state known as cognitive dissonance, which occurs when you encounter information that contradicts something you believe to be true. Rather than updating your beliefs to match new evidence, your mind takes a shortcut by simply filtering out or reinterpreting the contradictory information so that you can maintain your existing worldview intact. This filtering happens largely outside your conscious awareness, which makes it particularly insidious and difficult to counteract. Imagine you are sitting across from someone you care about, and you present them with evidence that contradicts something they deeply believe. You expect that they will reconsider their position, perhaps adjust their view slightly in light of the new information you have shared. Instead, something unexpected happens. Rather than accepting the evidence, they become more entrenched in their original belief, more convinced than ever that they were right all along. This phenomenon is known as the Backfire Effect, and it represents one of the most frustrating and perplexing aspects of human reasoning. The Backfire Effect occurs when exposure to factual information that challenges our existing beliefs actually causes us to hold those beliefs even more strongly and defend them with greater vigor. When we encounter evidence that contradicts our worldview, our minds do not simply update like a computer program receiving new data. Instead, we experience a kind of psychological threat. Our brain perceives this contradiction as an attack on our identity, our values, and our sense of competence and understanding. This activation of defensive mechanisms causes us to reject the new information and cling more tightly to what we already believe, a process rooted in cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that arises when we hold two conflicting ideas simultaneously. What makes the backfire effect particularly intriguing from a neuroscientific perspective is that it operates entirely below our conscious awareness. We do not intentionally choose to reject evidence or to become more stubborn. Rather, our mind automatically protects our existing belief structures through processes like selective exposure, where we seek out information that confirms what we already think while avoiding information that challenges us. This automatic defensive response served us well in ancient environments where consistency in belief might have been crucial for group cohesion and survival. Imagine a person who considers themselves environmentally conscious, yet drives a gas-guzzling sport utility vehicle every single day, justifying it by saying they recycle their plastic bottles and reusable shopping bags. Or consider the smoker who genuinely believes they will quit tomorrow, year after year, while simultaneously purchasing another pack at the convenience store. These scenarios represent one of the most pervasive and peculiar aspects of human psychology, known as cognitive dissonance, which occurs when your mind holds two contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes at the same time, creating a deeply uncomfortable psychological tension that your brain actively works to resolve. The mechanism behind cognitive dissonance is rooted in our fundamental human need for consistency and coherence in how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. When we encounter information or perform actions that contradict our self-image or existing beliefs, our minds trigger an internal alarm system, generating anxiety and emotional discomfort that we instinctively seek to eliminate. Rather than simply accepting the contradiction and adjusting our behavior accordingly, which would require effort and potentially painful self-reflection, our minds typically resort to elaborate mental gymnastics, including rationalization, denial, and justification. A person might convince themselves that their contradictory behavior is actually consistent with their values through creative reframing, or they might minimize the importance of one of the conflicting beliefs to reduce the psychological strain. What makes cognitive dissonance particularly fascinating is how resilient it remains despite our awareness of logic and reason. Even highly intelligent individuals, scientists, and philosophers experience cognitive dissonance regularly, yet they continue to maintain contradictory beliefs about everything from their personal habits to their professional responsibilities. Imagine you meet someone for the first time, and they happen to be physically attractive, well-dressed, and speak with confidence and charm, and because of these immediately visible positive qualities, you automatically assume they must also be intelligent, trustworthy, kind, and competent in their professional endeavors, even though you have gathered absolutely no evidence about any of these deeper characteristics. This tendency is called the halo effect, and it describes our deeply rooted human inclination to let one prominent positive trait cast a glowing shadow over our entire perception of a person, influencing how we judge their abilities, intentions, and moral character in ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with the original trait we noticed. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to stem from our brain's efficiency-seeking nature and its reliance on mental shortcuts. For when we encounter someone with a salient positive quality, our mind essentially takes a cognitive shortcut by assuming that positive traits tend to cluster together in individuals. So if someone is physically beautiful or confident, our brain unconsciously infers they must possess many other positive qualities as well. Even though attractiveness and intelligence are entirely independent variables with no causal relationship, this mental shortcut likely evolved because in smaller ancestral communities, people who were successful and healthy may have indeed possessed multiple advantages, so our ancestors learned to use visible markers as efficient predictors of overall quality. Imagine you are shopping for a new jacket, and the first price you see is $200, with a label indicating it has been marked down from $400. Your mind instantly registers this as a tremendous bargain, and you feel compelled to purchase it, even though you had never intended to spend more than $150 before entering the store. This is anchoring bias in its most practical form, a cognitive phenomenon where the first number or piece of information you encounter becomes a reference point that disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments and decisions. The initial price, whether genuinely reduced or artificially inflated by clever marketing, becomes an anchor that your mind uses to evaluate whether the current price represents fair value or exceptional savings. The psychological mechanism behind this strange mental habit operates through a process called insufficient adjustment, where your brain takes the anchor as a starting point and then makes small adjustments from that reference, rather than calculating value from scratch using independent reasoning. When you see that $400 original price, your brain doesn't dismiss it as irrelevant information. Instead, it uses it as a gravitational center around which all other price judgments orbit, causing you to perceive $200 as remarkably inexpensive. What makes anchoring bias particularly peculiar is that it persists even when you consciously know the anchor is arbitrary or irrelevant, even when you are aware that the store owner deliberately placed it there to manipulate your perception. Studies have shown that anchoring effects influence salary negotiations, real estate transactions, medical diagnoses, and courtroom judgments, suggesting that despite living in an age of information and critical thinking, we remain profoundly susceptible to the gravitational pull of first impressions and initial numbers. Consider a medical scenario where a doctor presents treatment options to a patient suffering from a serious illness, and imagine two physicians describing the identical procedure in subtly different ways. The first doctor says that if you choose surgery, there is a 90% chance you will survive the procedure, while the second doctor says that if you choose surgery, there is a 10% chance you will die from the procedure. These two statements contain exactly the same information, yet they produce dramatically different responses in the patient's mind. When the survival rate is emphasized, patients tend to feel more optimistic and are more likely to choose the surgical option, but when the mortality rate is emphasized, the same patients experience anxiety and often decline the very same procedure. This phenomenon, known as the framing effect, reveals something startling about human decision-making that operates beneath our conscious awareness every single moment of every day. The human brain does not process information in isolation or through pure logic. Instead, it evaluates choices based on the context and language through which those choices are presented, and this contextual wrapper around information has an almost magical power to reshape our preferences and beliefs. The framing effect occurs because our minds are not calculating machines that weigh options against objective criteria. Rather, our brains are narrative processors that construct meaning from the stories we tell ourselves about situations. When a choice is framed as a potential gain, we become risk-averse and prefer safer options. But when that same choice is framed as avoiding a potential loss, we suddenly become risk-seeking and willing to gamble on more dramatic outcomes. This asymmetry in how we evaluate gains versus losses reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. We are not motivated equally by the prospect of winning something and the prospect of losing something we already possess. The fear of loss is approximately twice as powerful as the pleasure of equivalent gain, a principle psychologists call loss aversion. Imagine you are offered a simple choice. You can either accept a guaranteed gain of $50, or you can flip a coin where heads gives you $100 and tails gives you nothing. Logically, both options have the same expected value of $50, yet the overwhelming majority of people choose the guaranteed gain, preferring certainty over potential reward. Now reverse the scenario. You can either accept a guaranteed loss of $50 or flip that same coin where heads costs you $100 and tails costs you nothing. Suddenly, people's behavior inverts completely, and most will take the gamble despite the identical expected loss. This asymmetry in how we process gains and losses is the essence of loss aversion, a cognitive bias so fundamental to human psychology that it shapes nearly every financial decision we make, from purchasing insurance to avoiding stock market investments to keeping money in savings accounts earning minimal interest. The psychological mechanism underlying loss aversion appears to be rooted in our evolutionary past, where the consequences of losing essential resources like food or shelter were far more severe than the benefits of gaining surplus, meaning our ancestors who felt the sting of loss more acutely than the pleasure of equivalent gains were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. This ancient survival mechanism, however, persists in modern environments where most losses are not existential threats, but merely reductions in numerical wealth. Yet our emotional response to losing money remains disproportionately intense compared to our pleasure at gaining the same amount. Imagine you receive a coffee mug as a gift, perhaps at the end of a conference or as a promotional item from a company you've never heard of before. You place it on your desk and use it occasionally, and over the course of a few weeks, it becomes part of your daily routine. Now imagine a researcher approaches you and offers to trade that mug for a pen, or perhaps offers to buy it from you for $5. Most people would refuse this trade, claiming that the mug is worth more to them than $5 or that they simply prefer the mug to the pen. But here is where the bizarre truth emerges. If that same researcher had instead offered you the mug or the pen at the beginning of the study when you had no prior ownership, you would have been largely indifferent between the two items. The moment you owned the mug, however, it became more valuable in your mind, not because it changed in any physical or functional way, but simply because you owned it. This phenomenon is called the Endowment Effect, and it describes our deeply irrational tendency to value something more highly simply because we possess it. The mechanism behind this effect appears to involve a combination of psychological factors that work together to inflate the value of our possessions. When we own something, we experience a sense of psychological ownership that goes beyond the legal or practical aspects of possession. Our brains begin to incorporate owned objects into our sense of self and identity, treating them almost as extensions of ourselves. This process triggers loss aversion, one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making, which makes us feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Additionally, when we own an object, we tend to selectively attend to its positive features while overlooking or minimizing its flaws, a process known as rationalization or motivated cognition. We become more aware of why we might have chosen it in the first place, even if that choice was largely arbitrary. Imagine you are offered a choice. You can receive $10 today, or you can receive $15 1 month from now. Most people choose the $10 immediately, preferring the certainty and immediate gratification of having money in hand right now rather than waiting those 30 days for a larger sum. Now imagine a different scenario where you are asked the same question, but both options are pushed forward in time. You can receive $10 in 1 year or $15 in 1 year and 1 month. Suddenly, most people's preferences reverse, and they choose to wait the extra month for the larger amount. This bizarre reversal in preference, despite the mathematical relationship between the choices remaining exactly identical, is called hyperbolic discounting, and it reveals something fundamental about how the human mind processes time and value. The mechanism at work here involves the way our brains discount future rewards, meaning we reduce the perceived value of something the further away it is in time. However, this discounting does not occur in a consistent, linear fashion as logical mathematics would suggest. Instead, our minds apply a hyperbolic curve to these valuations, meaning the discount rate is steepest for immediate choices and flattens out as we move further into the future. The immediate future looms so large in our perception that it overwhelms rational consideration, which is why the difference between today and next month feels enormous, while the difference between 1 year from now and 1 year and 1 month feels relatively insignificant. Evolutionary psychologists suggest this pattern made sense for our ancestors, who lived in immediate survival contexts where securing resources right now could mean the difference between eating and starving, making present rewards genuinely more valuable than distant ones. Consider a person sitting at a roulette table, watching the wheel spin red numbers 10 times in a row, and they become increasingly convinced that black must come next, so they place their money on black with growing confidence, believing that the odds have somehow shifted in their favor after this streak of reds. Yet the wheel has no memory. The probability remains exactly the same at 50% regardless of what came before, and this is the gambler's fallacy. A deeply ingrained cognitive bias that convinces us that past random events influence the probability of future random events, when in mathematical reality, they do not. The mechanism underlying this illusion is rooted in how our brains seek patterns and meaning in chaos, as our ancestors survived by detecting genuine patterns in nature like animal migration or seasonal weather changes. So our minds evolved to be pattern recognition machines, constantly scanning for sequences and causality even when none exists. When we observe a string of identical outcomes, our brain interprets this as evidence of some underlying force or imbalance that must correct itself, a phenomenon psychologists call the law of small numbers, where we assume that small samples should reflect the true probability distribution. And since we know that over infinite spins, a roulette wheel produces roughly equal reds and blacks, we mistakenly believe that a short sequence of one color means the other color is now overdue and therefore more likely to appear. What makes this fallacy particularly persistent is that it feels intuitively correct, almost morally right, as if the universe maintains some kind of cosmic balance sheet where debts must be repaid, yet probability operates with complete indifference to our intuitions or sense of fairness. And a coin has no obligation to produce heads after a long string of tails simply because we expect equilibrium to be restored in the near term. Imagine you are driving along a familiar highway and you suddenly notice that you see a particular model of car everywhere. A blue sedan that seems to appear constantly in your mirrors and alongside you on the road, appearing with such frequency that you begin to wonder if there has been some kind of recall or massive sale of this vehicle in your region. You mention this observation to a friend who listens patiently and then gently points out that this car model has always been equally common on the roads, and that your newfound awareness of it is merely the result of your attention being drawn to it once, after which your brain began collecting and emphasizing every instance you encountered. This phenomenon is called the clustering illusion, and it represents one of the most persistent and pervasive ways that human minds construct false patterns from genuinely random data. The clustering illusion occurs because our brains are extraordinarily efficient pattern recognition machines, so efficient in fact that they often detect patterns that do not actually exist in any meaningful way. When we experience something by chance, perhaps noticing a specific word or name or color, our brains enter a heightened state of awareness regarding that particular stimulus, and consequently we begin to notice it far more frequently than we did before, not because its frequency has increased in reality, but because our selective attention has shifted to emphasize its presence. This is a direct consequence of how human memory and perception evolved. For our ancestors, the ability to notice patterns, even patterns that might be coincidental, could have meant the difference between survival and danger, so we developed brains that erred heavily on the side of pattern detection. Deep within the human mind exists a peculiar and persistent belief that the world operates according to a kind of cosmic fairness, a notion so ingrained in our thinking that we rarely question its validity, and this belief manifests itself in countless ways throughout our daily lives and interactions with others. When we observe someone experiencing misfortune, whether that person has lost their job, suffered a serious illness, or fallen victim to an accident, we often instinctively search for reasons that might explain their suffering, and remarkably, we frequently convince ourselves that they must have done something to deserve it, that their circumstances resulted from their own poor choices or moral failings, rather than accepting the uncomfortable truth that random and terrible things happen to people regardless of their character or actions. This psychological tendency, known as the just world hypothesis, compels us to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, creating a comforting narrative that allows us to feel secure in our own position and convinced that if we simply behave morally and make wise decisions, we can insulate ourselves from tragedy and suffering. The mechanism driving this belief operates at a fundamental level of human cognition, stemming from our deep need to feel in control of our environment and to construct a coherent, predictable world in which cause and effect operate clearly and rationally. And when we attribute someone else's misfortune to their own failings, we implicitly reassure ourselves that such misfortune could not befall us unless we similarly erred. Imagine you're sitting in traffic and the car ahead of you suddenly brakes hard without warning. Your immediate thought is that the driver is reckless, careless, or perhaps distracted by their phone. You might even feel a flash of anger at their incompetence. What you don't consider in that moment is that they may have spotted a child running into the street or a pothole that could damage their vehicle, or that they've just received devastating news and are emotionally overwhelmed. Yet your brain has already made its judgment. This tendency, this almost automatic leap to blame someone's character rather than their circumstances, is what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, and it is perhaps one of the most pervasive biases in human thinking. When we observe someone's behavior, we have a powerful inclination to attribute their actions to internal factors, to who they are as a person, rather than to the external situation they find themselves in. A person who arrives late to work must be irresponsible, we think, not considering the traffic accident on their usual route or the family emergency they just left. Someone who speaks harshly in a meeting must be aggressive by nature, not someone dealing with chronic pain or sleep deprivation. This bias emerges because our minds are pattern-matching machines that work primarily with the information most immediately available to us. The person's action is visible and concrete, right there in front of us, while the contextual factors, the invisible pressures and circumstances that shape that moment, are abstract and absent from our direct perception. Our brains seem to prefer the simplicity of character-based explanations over the complexity of situational analysis, and we deploy this preference so consistently that we often fail to notice we're doing it at all. What makes this phenomenon particularly strange is that we don't apply this same error to ourselves. When we arrive late, we know it was the traffic. When we speak harshly, we understand the stress we're under. Imagine receiving 10 compliments during your day and one criticism, and as you lie in bed that night, your mind replays the single negative comment over and over while the praise fades into the background like white noise. This peculiar phenomenon is called negativity bias, and it represents one of the most fundamental asymmetries in how the human brain processes information and stores memories. Our minds are exquisitely attuned to threats, dangers, and negative experiences in ways that positive experiences simply cannot match, creating a lopsided emotional landscape where bad news weighs approximately 3 times heavier than good news in our psychological accounting. When you receive a rejection email after applying for a job, that sting can occupy your thoughts for weeks, overshadowing the numerous acceptance letters or positive feedback you may have received in the same period. Your brain treats this negativity as urgent information that demands attention and analysis, evolutionarily speaking, because our ancestors who obsessed over potential dangers and threats were more likely to survive and pass on their genes than those who remained complacent and optimistic about their surroundings. This survival mechanism made perfect sense when humans lived in environments filled with predators and immediate physical dangers, where overlooking a threat could mean death. However, in our modern world of emails and social media and perceived slights from colleagues, this ancient neural wiring continues to fire with the same intensity it once did for genuine life-threatening situations. We find ourselves ruminating over an awkward conversation from last year, replaying our mistakes in painful detail, and catastrophizing about potential future failures while simultaneously minimizing and forgetting moments of genuine accomplishment and joy. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to involve the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, with negative stimuli triggering faster and stronger activation in these brain regions compared to positive stimuli, essentially commanding more neural resources and creating stronger memory traces. Imagine you've just finished a 2-hour dental appointment where the dentist spent the first 90 minutes drilling and filling your teeth, causing you considerable discomfort throughout the procedure. But then during the final 10 minutes, she simply cleaned your teeth gently and applied a pleasant-tasting fluoride treatment that felt soothing and painless. Now imagine an alternative scenario where you had a relatively comfortable first hour and 50 minutes, but the dentist ended by performing an unexpected and intensely painful root canal procedure that lasted the final 10 minutes. Research has consistently shown that most people report the first experience as significantly less unpleasant than the second, even though the total duration of pain and discomfort was essentially identical in both situations. This phenomenon is called the Purkinje rule, and it represents a profound quirk in how our brains evaluate and remember experiences. The rule dictates that our overall assessment of any experience depends almost entirely on 2 moments: the peak moment, which is the most intense point of the experience, whether positive or negative, and the end moment, which is how the experience concludes. Duration of the experience, the overall trajectory, and countless other factors fade into irrelevance compared to these 2 critical points. Our brains appear to have evolved a memory system that prioritizes intensity and recency over accuracy and totality, which would have been useful in ancestral environments, where remembering the worst part of an encounter with danger or the final impression of a food source might have been more important for survival than meticulously cataloging every moment. Yet in our modern world, this mechanism creates a systematic bias in how we plan our lives and make decisions about which experiences to pursue. We endure long flights happily if the destination is wonderful, we sit through mediocre concerts because the finale is spectacular, and we tolerate tedious meetings because they end with good news. Imagine purchasing your dream car after years of saving, feeling an overwhelming surge of joy and pride as you sit in the driver's seat for the first time, only to find that within a few months, that same vehicle feels utterly ordinary, no longer capable of triggering the euphoria you once experienced. Or consider winning a substantial sum of money in a lottery, experiencing days of pure elation, and imagining how this windfall will permanently transform your happiness, yet discovering that within a year or even less, your baseline emotional state has returned almost entirely to where it was before, the money now simply woven into the fabric of your normal existence without any lasting elevation of mood. This phenomenon is called hedonic adaptation, and it represents one of the mind's most peculiar and relentless features. The brain appears to possess an internal thermostat for happiness, constantly adjusting what feels normal and neutral so that even dramatic positive changes in your life eventually become invisible to your emotional system. The mechanism underlying this adaptation likely evolved as a survival advantage, allowing our ancestors to quickly return to a baseline state of alertness and caution rather than remaining in a permanently euphoric state that might cloud their judgment or distract them from genuine threats. By recalibrating expectations upward with each positive experience, the mind ensures that novelty and appreciation fade, forcing consciousness to remain attuned to change rather than trapped in complacency. Yet this same adaptation works with ruthless efficiency in both directions, meaning that negative experiences also eventually feel normalized, a psychological mercy that paradoxically also traps us in cycles where we pursue the next achievement or acquisition believing it will finally stick, when in fact nothing ever truly sticks in the way we imagine it will. Imagine yourself at the end of a long day, standing in front of your closet trying to choose what to wear tomorrow. And suddenly, the simple act of selecting between two nearly identical shirts feels impossibly exhausting, almost paralyzing, as if you were being asked to make a decision of genuine consequence rather than a trivial wardrobe choice. This peculiar mental state is known as decision fatigue, a phenomenon in which the quality and efficiency of your decision-making deteriorates measurably after you have made numerous choices throughout the day, regardless of whether those choices were important or mundane. Throughout your waking hours, your brain is constantly engaged in the process of making decisions, some significant and others barely noticeable, yet each one draws from the same limited reservoir of mental energy and cognitive resources. With each choice you make, whether it is what to eat for breakfast, which email to respond to first, or whether to accept a meeting invitation, you deplete this finite pool of decision-making capacity. And as the hours accumulate and your choices multiply, your brain becomes progressively less capable of evaluating options rationally and efficiently. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be rooted in the metabolic demands of executive function, as the prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for deliberation and rational choice, requires substantial amounts of glucose and mental energy to operate at full capacity. When this resource becomes depleted through continuous use without adequate rest or replenishment, the brain begins to take shortcuts and exhibit what researchers describe as decision avoidance, where you either procrastinate on making choices or default to whatever option requires the least cognitive effort rather than the one most aligned with your actual preferences. Consider the peculiar transformation that has occurred in human memory over the past 2 decades, a shift so gradual that most of us have failed to notice its profound implications on how we store and retrieve information. When you encounter a question or fact that you cannot immediately recall, your instinctive response is no longer to struggle through the corridors of your own memory or to consult a physical reference book, but rather to reach for your phone and search the internet within seconds. This phenomenon, known as the Google effect or digital amnesia, describes our tendency to forget information that we know we can easily access online, a form of cognitive restructuring where our brains have essentially outsourced memory storage to external digital devices. The mechanism underlying this effect is rooted in something psychologists call transactive memory, which is the idea that we don't need to remember everything ourselves when we can remember where to find the information, or more accurately in our modern context, we simply remember that we can Google it. Our brains are fundamentally lazy in the most efficient way possible, and they have recognized that memorizing facts has become redundant when those facts exist in perfect, unchanging form in databases we can access instantly. This represents a radical departure from how human memory functioned for millennia, when the ability to retain and recall information was not merely convenient but essential for survival and social status. Yet what makes this effect so bizarrely normalized is that we have collectively accepted this cognitive shift without much resistance or genuine concern, viewing it not as a diminishment of our mental capacities, but rather as an intelligent adaptation to an information-rich environment. We have essentially delegated our memory function to Silicon Valley, trusting that our devices will always be available and that the internet will persist indefinitely, assumptions that have become so embedded in our daily consciousness that we rarely pause to consider what might happen if that infrastructure suddenly vanished. Imagine a person collapsed on a busy city street, unresponsive and clearly in distress, surrounded by dozens of pedestrians who slow their pace, glance momentarily, and continue walking past without stopping or calling for help. each one assuming that surely someone else will intervene, that the situation must not be as serious as it appears if no one else is acting, that their individual contribution would be redundant or unnecessary in a crowd of potential helpers. This phenomenon, known as the bystander effect, represents one of the most counterintuitive and troubling aspects of human psychology, where the presence of others paradoxically decreases the likelihood that any single individual will offer assistance or take action in an emergency situation. The mechanism underlying this strange inversion of logic operates through several interconnected psychological processes that our minds execute almost automatically when we find ourselves in groups. First, there exists a diffusion of responsibility, where each person in a crowd unconsciously distributes the burden of action across all present observers, creating a false sense that someone else bears greater obligation to help, and therefore one's own responsibility becomes diluted and manageable to ignore. Simultaneously, pluralistic ignorance takes hold, wherein individuals look to the reactions of others to determine how to respond themselves, and when everyone else appears calm and uninvolved, each person interprets this collective passivity as evidence that intervention is unnecessary or inappropriate, creating a feedback loop of inaction that reinforces itself. Additionally, the fear of social judgment prevents individuals from acting, as doing something unusual in front of strangers triggers anxiety about embarrassment, ridicule, or appearing foolish if one's interpretation of the situation proves incorrect. Imagine a person who has applied for job after job, only to receive rejection letters with such consistency that they eventually stop applying altogether, convinced that their efforts will always end in failure regardless of what they do or how well they prepare. This is learned helplessness, a psychological condition where individuals come to believe that they have no control over the outcomes of their lives, and consequently, they cease to try. The phenomenon was first documented through experiments conducted by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s, where dogs were exposed to inescapable electric shocks and later, when given the opportunity to escape, simply lay down and accepted the punishment rather than attempting to flee, having learned through repeated exposure that their actions were futile. The mechanism underlying this condition operates through a fundamental restructuring of how the brain processes causality and agency, essentially teaching the mind that there exists no meaningful connection between effort and outcome, and therefore there exists no point in expending energy toward change. Over time, repeated exposure to situations perceived as uncontrollable creates neural pathways that automatically default to passivity and resignation, transforming what began as a rational response to genuine powerlessness into a pervasive worldview that persists even when circumstances fundamentally change and control becomes available. What makes learned helplessness particularly peculiar is that it can survive in defiance of clear evidence to the contrary. A person may achieve success, yet remain convinced of their fundamental inability to succeed, dismissing positive outcomes as flukes or attributing them to external luck rather than personal competence. In August of 1933, a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden took an unexpected turn when the perpetrator took 4 employees hostage inside the bank's vault and held them there for 5 days while police negotiated outside. During those 5 days of captivity, something peculiar began to happen inside that confined space. The hostages, who had every reason to fear their captor, began to develop a strange sense of loyalty toward him, even expressing sympathy for his circumstances and viewing the police negotiating outside as a greater threat than the man holding them at gunpoint. When they were finally released, several of the hostages maintained contact with their captor and even defended him to authorities, demonstrating an emotional attachment that seemed entirely counterintuitive to their traumatic experience. This phenomenon became so notable that psychologists eventually named it Stockholm Syndrome, and it has since been observed in numerous kidnapping cases, hostage situations, and abusive relationships around the world. The psychological mechanism behind this bizarre response appears to involve a survival mechanism that activates when people find themselves in situations of complete powerlessness and dependency. When a person is held captive and their survival becomes dependent on another individual, the human mind engages in a form of psychological adaptation where it reframes the situation to make it emotionally tolerable. By finding positive qualities in the captor or rationalizing the captor's behavior, the hostage reduces the cognitive dissonance created by being simultaneously terrified and reliant on the same person. Additionally, small acts of kindness from the captor, such as providing food, allowing bathroom breaks, or simply not harming them further, are disproportionately valued because the baseline expectation has been set so devastatingly low. The hostage's brain essentially recalibrates its emotional reference point, transforming occasional mercy into something resembling care and gratitude. Imagine walking into a room where the walls are painted a soft blue, where the lighting is dim and warm, where classical music plays quietly in the background, and you find yourself inexplicably calm and reflective, ready to engage in thoughtful conversation or introspection. Now imagine the same room painted bright red, illuminated with harsh fluorescent lights and filled with upbeat pop music, and suddenly you feel energized, alert, and inclined toward quick decision-making and social engagement. You have not consciously decided to feel these ways, and the room itself contains no logical reason to alter your psychological state so dramatically, yet your mind has already been primed by the environmental cues that surround you. Priming is the phenomenon by which exposure to one stimulus unconsciously influences how you respond to a subsequent stimulus, and it operates with remarkable consistency across human cognition and behavior. The mechanism behind priming is rooted in how our brains organize information through networks of associations and memories. When you encounter a stimulus, whether it is a word, an image, a smell, or a sensation, your brain activates not only that specific concept, but also all the related concepts connected to it in your mental network. If someone mentions the word ocean, your brain automatically activates related concepts like waves, sand, fish, and vastness, creating a spreading activation throughout your neural landscape. When a second stimulus then appears, your brain processes it more quickly and with greater ease if it is related to the priming stimulus, because those neural pathways are already partially activated and ready to fire. What makes priming so remarkable, and what makes it persist despite our general awareness of how our minds work, is that it operates almost entirely outside of consciousness. You cannot override it simply by knowing it exists, and you cannot prevent your brain from making these automatic associations. A person primed with words related to old age will walk more slowly down a hallway after the experiment, without realizing their behavior has been influenced. Your gut possesses approximately 100 billion neurons, a number nearly equal to all the neurons in your brain itself. And these neurons operate with such autonomy and intelligence that neuroscientists have begun referring to your digestive system as the enteric nervous system or the second brain. This neural network extends from your esophagus through your entire gastrointestinal tract and communicates with your central nervous system through the vagus nerve, a connection so significant that your gut can essentially think and make decisions independently of your conscious awareness. When you experience a sudden wave of nausea before an important presentation, or when you feel butterflies in your stomach during moments of profound anxiety, you are witnessing this second brain responding to emotional and psychological stimuli without any direct input from your thinking mind. The gut produces approximately 90% of your body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter responsible for mood regulation and emotional stability. Yet most people remain completely unaware that their emotional state is being chemically regulated by an organ they associate primarily with digestion. Your intestinal bacteria, collectively known as the microbiome, communicate directly with your enteric nervous system and influence everything from your stress response to your appetite to your ability to feel motivated or depressed on any given day. This second brain remembers patterns, processes information about what you consume, anticipates what your body will need next, and can even override signals from your conscious mind when it determines that survival requires immediate action. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the same types of neural processing that occur in your skull brain, including neurotransmitter production, electrical signaling, and information storage. Yet we continue to treat our gut feelings and digestive health as separate from our mental and emotional well-being, despite overwhelming scientific evidence demonstrating their profound interconnection. Your brain is not the fixed, unchanging organ that neuroscientists once believed it to be, but rather a constantly reshaping landscape of neural connections that respond to experience, behavior, and even conscious intention, which means that every time you learn a new skill, navigate a different route home, or practice a musical instrument, you are literally rewiring the physical structure of your mind at the cellular level. When a London taxi driver spends years memorizing the complex streets of the city, their hippocampus, the brain region responsible for spatial memory, actually grows larger and more densely connected, a transformation that can be measured and documented through brain imaging, demonstrating that the architecture of thought itself is not predetermined but sculpted by the demands we place upon it. This phenomenon, called neuroplasticity, reveals that your brain maintains the capacity to form new neural pathways throughout your entire life, meaning that even in advanced age, you can learn languages, develop new talents, recover from stroke damage, or retrain your mind to process information in fundamentally different ways. The mechanism underlying this malleability involves the strengthening and weakening of synaptic connections between neurons based on how frequently they are activated together, a principle often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together, combined with the brain's ability to recruit entirely different regions to compensate when injury or intentional training requires it. Your brain is consuming approximately 20 watts of electrical power at this very moment, a figure so remarkably modest that it becomes almost difficult to comprehend given everything your mind is simultaneously accomplishing. From processing the ambient sounds around you to maintaining your heartbeat, regulating your body temperature, filtering through countless memories, and constructing the very thoughts you are experiencing right now. To put this energy consumption into perspective, a single incandescent light bulb typically uses between 40 and 60 watts, meaning your entire conscious and unconscious mental apparatus requires less electricity than what was once needed to illuminate a moderately bright room in homes across the world. This extraordinary efficiency is made possible through the intricate architecture of neurons and synapses, billions upon billions of them arranged in patterns so complex that neuroscientists are still discovering new pathways and mechanisms of communication that were previously unknown to us. Your brain achieves this remarkable feat through what scientists call neural pruning and the selective firing of neurons, a process where your mind has essentially learned over millions of years of evolution to use only the electrical impulses it absolutely needs, shutting down unnecessary activity and routing signals along the most efficient pathways possible. What makes this fact truly peculiar is that despite this minuscule energy requirement, the brain remains extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption, fatigue, and dysfunction when its fuel supply is compromised even slightly, suggesting that the 20 watts is not merely sufficient, but represents an optimal balance finely tuned by natural selection over countless generations. We have somehow normalized this astonishing reality, treating it as merely one more physiological fact rather than the profound miracle it truly represents. And yet your mind's ability to run on less power than a dim light bulb while orchestrating the symphony of human consciousness remains one of nature's most elegant demonstrations of efficiency and design. Consider for a moment the extraordinary fact that nestled within your skull, suspended in cerebrospinal fluid and protected by bone, exists a structure so monumentally complex that scientists estimate it contains approximately 86 billion individual neurons, each one a microscopic processing unit firing electrical signals at speeds that would make the fastest computers seem sluggish by comparison. These neurons do not exist in isolation, but rather form connections with other neurons through structures called synapses, and the sheer number of possible connections between these 86 billion units creates a combinatorial explosion of potential neural pathways that exceeds the number of stars visible in the observable universe. A fact that becomes almost incomprehensible when you attempt to visualize the architectural sophistication contained within the roughly 3-pound mass of tissue that generates everything you think, feel, remember, and experience. The mechanism underlying this staggering complexity is rooted in evolutionary biology and developmental neuroscience, where billions of years of natural selection have refined a system capable of processing sensory information, extracting patterns, forming memories, and generating consciousness through the elegant interplay of electrochemical activity across vast networks of interconnected cells. Each neuron following relatively simple rules, yet collectively producing the emergent phenomenon of human awareness and cognition.